Good afternoon, everyone. I know everybody's having such a good time. I hate to interrupt the conversation. Good afternoon. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to Living Together by Design, Housing to Connect Generations. Welcome to those of you in the room and those of you watching online. First, a few housekeeping items. A quick reminder that we have live captioning available. For those joining virtually, please click the closed captioning icon. And for our in-person audience, please use the QR code currently on screen and visit the AV booth up there if you need assistance. I want to give a plug for a couple of upcoming events. Next Tuesday, April 14th at 4 o'clock, the Joint Center, along with Harvard's Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston, the Cambridge Community Foundation, and the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority, will be hosting the event Beyond Urban Renewal, Retooling Redevelopment Authorities to Create Social Housing in Massachusetts, featuring a new Joint Center report examining how redevelopment authorities might support the development of new affordable housing, particularly social housing. That is it's a hybrid event. The live portion is actually full, so if you want to see it, you can go to our website, register, and watch it online. That same evening, here at the GSD, this is the 14th at 6:30 p.m., the Graduate School of Design will host a lecture by Deborah Archer, President of the American Civil Liberties Union, on her recent book, Dividing Lines, How Transportation Infrastructure Reinforces Racial Inequality and Its Relevance to Designers and Planners. All right, that's enough for the public service announcements. On to today's event. So today's event is going to focus on intergenerational housing and communities, places that purposefully house people of all ages, and in doing so, offer powerful ways to reduce social isolation, improve affordability, and strengthen access to supports. While this is not a new idea, innovative models are emerging that can provide valuable insights into housing design and policy. This afternoon, leaders from architecture, planning, home building, environmental gerontology, public health, and related fields, that's a lot of fields already, so I'm not sure what the related fields are, but we'll discuss these new approaches in 3 panels, one focused on households, one on buildings, and one on neighborhoods and cities. So before that, I have a bunch of thank yous. I first want to thank the organizers for today's events, Jen Molinsky, who directs the Joint Center's Housing and Aging Society program, Tim Love, Assistant Director of GSD's Master in Real Estate program, also a lecturer and Senior Fellow in Real Estate and Urban Planning at the GSD, and Jenny French, an Assistant Professor in Practice at Architecture at the GSD. Thank you guys for all your work in pulling this event together. And then also I have to thank people behind the scenes of the Joint Center, David Luberoff, James Chaknis, and Samara Scheckler, who both helped run the logistics and helped inform the content. And then finally, the GSD's team, Matt Smith, Sarah Rafson, and Raquel Rivera, who are really amazing at doing these events and so wonderful to work with. So thank all of you folks as well. All right. Now to the main event. Let me pass it off to my colleague, Jen Molinsky, who will provide an overview on the scale and scaling of intergenerational living. The floor is yours, Jen.
Sorry. Thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone. I'm really delighted that you're all here for Living Together by Design. This afternoon, we are going to explore intergenerational living through housing, communities, neighborhoods, and cities. We're going to ask what makes a home or a city block intergenerational, what innovations are we seeing, and what it takes to scale those innovations so that more people have opportunities to benefit from the opportunities that intergenerational exchange can supply. As Chris noted, this is truly a collaborative event, and I too want to thank Jenny and Tim for working with me to organize and imagine this day. Intergenerational living is obviously inherently interdisciplinary. Success, which we will also try to define this afternoon, requires thoughtful design that facilitates meaningful interaction. It requires land use regulations that support non-traditional ways of living, or at least non-traditional in the context of the last 100 years or so and what our zoning has tried to do. It requires programs that incentivize and support, or at least don't inhibit, the development of beautiful and functional shared spaces in mixed-age housing. Interest in intergenerational housing is on the rise. One reason is that, like housing shared by people of the same generation, it can help address housing affordability, often without adding new homes to the housing stock. Lower costs and lighter carbon footprints can also be goals in co-housing and other intentional communities where people have their own housing unit but share common indoor and outdoor spaces and other resources. And living with others, whether under one roof or in an intergenerational, intentional community, has the potential to address loneliness and isolation, both of which have significant effects on health. But why intergenerational? What is it about living with or in close proximity to people of different generations that can be valuable? I'll suggest a couple of reasons, and then I know our panelists will take it from there, and we'll explore a lot of this in the first panel as well. One reason is access to care. In addition to a housing affordability crisis, the nation is also facing a care crisis. From child care to home health services, care is expensive. Our own analysis at the Joint Center suggests that only 24% of single and couple adults 75 and over can afford both their housing and a daily visit from an in-home health aide. That's in part because a single daily visit from a non-medical care worker cost at the national median $51,000 last year. Meanwhile, the Department of Labor finds that the median cost in the U.S. for full-time childcare for one child was nearly $16,000 a few years back. And for those of you joining us from Massachusetts, either online or in person, yes, those costs are much higher here than the national averages. A further challenge is that the number of workers in the caring professions has decreased sharply in the last few years, even as the fastest growing segment of the population are people who are most likely to need care, those 80 and over. And so there's growing interest in housing solutions that enable families to more easily care for each other, whether that is grandparents raising or caring for grandkids or adults caring for their aging parents. And there's also interest in caring communities where mutual support across generations may be more informal but no less important. Neighbors lending a hand with shopping or occasional babysitting, a ride somewhere, or stepping in when there's greater periods of needs. A second reason for interest in intergenerational living is a belief that it can convey specific benefits to older and younger people under certain conditions, and we will definitely explore that in the first panel. For older adults, building relationships with younger people can be generative. It can be a way to give back, nurture, mentor, create a legacy for the future. This can be true within a family, but also within intentional communities like Treehouse, which we'll hear about today. For children, research has shown that intergenerational relationships can help build emotional resilience, social skills, a sense of belonging, and also reduce ageist stereotypes. And for all ages, we can imagine that intergenerational living can help reduce isolation and loneliness. We know, though, that not all intergenerational living situations are by choice, nor do they automatically produce these beneficial outcomes even when they are. So that's one question we want to ask today. What does success look like, and what ingredients do we need? And how do interventions at different scales matter? As we thought about how to organize today's event, we wrestled with a framework, whether to organize our day and our panels by the broad inputs that we think are needed for success, design, policy, programming, and how each contributes to the lived experience of people in intergenerational settings, or whether we should organize by scale, thinking through the opportunities and challenges for households, for buildings, for city blocks, for cities. Ultimately, we decided on scale, and our hope is that we can weave through all those other ingredients, the design, the policy, the programming, and the lived experience at each level as we go forward. So at the level of the house, there is a great deal of attention being paid to the increase in the number of multi-generational households. And a note on terminology, multi-generational, we are referring to more than one generation living together within a single household. So they're sharing a household, they share the same home, the same roof over their head. Typically, this can be defined as 2 or more adult generations, possibly a third generation with children, but I will note, and our panelists on our first panel will note as well, that definitions of multi-generational households vary by organization. So we'll be careful to explain what we mean. For some people, grandparents raising grandchildren without that middle generation is multi-generational. For others, it is just another household type, not specifically falling in this category. About 20% of the U.S. population lives in a multi-generational household, by our definition, 2 adult-related generations where the youngest adult is at least age 25. Our research shows that multi-generational households are more common as the population grows more diverse and as housing prices rise. But in addition, about 2% of people in the US live with non-relatives of a different generation. That's about 1.5 million unrelated adults living with someone of a different generation. So our first panel is going to explore the trends that drive this and the benefits it offers, as well as the challenges and the implications for policy planning and design. Our second panel will go up a step in scale to examine intentional intergenerational communities, places where, again, households have their own smaller private spaces but share communal resources like common rooms or kitchens for shared meals and even guest rooms for visitors. One type that we'll hear about is co-housing, typically resident developed, owned, and run, though we certainly have examples that include rental and income restricted models. And there are about 160 co-housing communities in the US, according to one estimate, housing about 13,000 people. Meanwhile, another model includes those nonprofit-led intentional communities that support specific populations, whether people with low incomes, grandparents raising grandchildren, or the innovative care house, which you'll also hear about today. These places are not age neutral. They're not a typical apartment building where people of all ages live. Rather, we're talking about places where people choose to live in community. And these can also be important to a neighborhood. They can provide an anchor, community space, childcare, cafes. They can be a home base in a larger, broader community. We then move to the neighborhood scale and ask, what does it take to make a neighborhood truly intergenerational? A place where multiple generations might find suitable housing and desirable amenities that meet their needs and might pass on the street, but also one where they actually have opportunities for meaningful interaction. We're fortunate today to have 4 guests working for the City of Boston to talk about what it takes to imagine an intergenerational city, what it takes to align investments and initiatives and departments to bring it into being. So, and I will say that the image on the left up there is the overhead view of a senior housing complex in London, but there are 2 preschools on site. So again, this is an example not of shared living spaces, but of co-location, and one of the things that we are going to explore is what are the benefits of interventions like that. So as I wrap up, please check out the work that we've done on intergenerational housing at the Joint Center, including a report on lessons from Germany on bridging generations that focused on publicly supported co-housing in Germany and included lessons for policy and design. Also, please check out our blueprint for intergenerational living, which we worked on with one of today's speakers, Donna Butts, and her organization, Generations United. And there will be more to come next year in a book published by the Danish Royal Academy's Architecture Program on age-integrated housing and neighborhoods, to which I and Lydia over there, a MUP student, are contributing a chapter. So we're looking forward to that. I want to end on a personal story that explains a little bit how I came to be here today, organizing a panel on intergenerational living. 21 years ago, I had a newborn and was looking for intergenerational connection. I was living in Cambridge, and frankly, I was looking for any adult connection. And I found a program that met in Yeovil House on Cambridge Street. Many of you might have passed it. It's across from the high school. It's an assisted living housing situation. And each week we would meet new parents, babies, and older residents in conversation, playing with the babies, having informal talks. It was a really wonderful experience, but then I realized something equally wonderful was that the residents were truly a part of the broader community. At the time, my own grandmother was residing in the single-family house that she had lived in for over 50 years. In a suburb and was quite isolated. My husband's grandparents were living in assisted living and in senior housing that was beautiful but tucked away in the woods and isolated from the rest of the community. So in this context, I would go to Yeovil House, and then one day at Darwin's, I don't know, who remembers Darwin's? For those of you who are newer to Cambridge, Darwin's is now the Asaro Cafe. I saw one of the most faithful members of our weekly group, one of the older residents at Darwin's, and it was a tiny moment, but one that inspired me to consider that those folks, those residents, were truly a part of this community, that we could see each other and interact, and they weren't tucked away, and we weren't, even though the housing was maybe senior only and was assisted living, we were not as age segregated as these other situations that I saw around me. So this has inspired me to consider how we can create housing in neighborhoods that facilitate this sort of interaction, this seeing and being seen, which I think is itself important. If we don't see people of different ages, we can forget about them, we can forget about their specific needs and interests, but also actual interaction. So I am thrilled that today is about wrestling with that question, and I'd like to welcome the first panel to come up. Thank you. I've moved us ahead of schedule in anticipation of us falling behind schedule, so this is all good. So welcome. I'm really pleased to welcome Donna Butts in the middle, for the former executive director and current senior fellow at Generations United. Noel Marcus on the end, who is the founder and CEO of Nesterly, and Natasha Pilkauskis, associate professor of public policy at the Ford School at Michigan. We're really sorry that Ernest Gonzalez, who was scheduled to be here, was not able to come today, but we hope that you follow the link in the agenda and on the event website to his bio and his publications. So we want to explore the prevalence of multi-generational households, and we're going to start with Donna. Can you speak to what's driving this trend that we're seeing in an increase in multi-generational households?
Well, Jen, thank you. And thanks everyone for being here. It's nice to see the interest in a topic that's really dear to my heart, and that is how we acknowledge the fact that we do have a growth in multi-generational households. Some people say when we advocate for them that we want to go back to the past, and I say no, it's going forward to the future, to a future that's good for all of us. So with multi-generational households, the biggest issue, I think, or biggest reason that they're growing is demand. With intergenerational communities, it's what consumers want. With families, they oftentimes come together by need, but they stay together by choice. And so Generations United in 2011, around the housing bust, did a survey of the families, because it's really easy for all of us to talk about multi-generational families, what it's like to be in a multi-generational family, and think it's terrible. But we actually asked the families and surveyed families, and then 10 years later, we did that again. So during the housing bust, what we found, again, was that people came together because they needed to financially. But then, when we went back 10 years later, we found that people stayed together. And again, they found that it met one of their needs. So the growth can be based on any sort of crisis or situation that our country faces. It can be based on the fact that we have an aging population and people find that caregiving across distance is difficult. They want people to be closer together. It can be by changes in our population. We see a higher percentage in new immigrant communities and people who may have brought that culture with them. So there are a number of reasons, including the financial strain, the caregiving strain, as well as people realizing that it's an opportunity to be together under one roof.
What do we know about the benefits of that? And then I'll turn to Natasha to talk a little bit more about her research, which looks at this as well.
As far as the benefits go, what was really interesting to me, the last survey we did in 2021, that it was caregiving across ages. 34% of families said that it helped them with childcare, and 34% said it helped them with elder care. So the caregiving aspect cuts across generations. And then you see that evolve as a family together ages in place, so that the older generation may have moved in to provide care for the children, and now the family's providing care for the older family member. So the benefits are that there's the financial benefits, that they're able to save, to maybe buy their own home or to go back to graduate school, or for whatever reason. It helps financially. It helps with sharing resources also. One of the benefits that isn't discussed very often is the environmental impact. And when you think about a family sharing resources, that means that they don't have to have 5 cars. They don't have to have 2 people living in a huge house and paying electric bills and paying this and paying that. They can actually pool their resources and share that responsibility. So there's the financial, there's the emotional, there's caregiving, and I think what's really, really critical is that connection, especially for young people, with their roots. And their culture, their heritage, their family stories. And then I'll just close with a quote from Margaret Mead that I really like, which is that nobody before has ever asked the nuclear family to live all by itself, alone, the way that we are doing, with no relatives, no support. We've put them in an impossible situation. So how we've grown this, and expecting someone like Jen to be alone without having that additional support of the community and of families, we need to make sure that we're saying that those bridges are okay and helping to build those bridges.
Thank you, Donna. Natasha, your work focuses on shared living arrangements, particularly from the children's perspective. Our work at the Joint Center is looking at it from the older adults' perspective. So can you speak to some of the challenges, the not by choice situations that may not be as beneficial or need some support to be that way?
So I just want to start with the premise that I'm agnostic about multi-generational households, because I'm going to speak about challenges. And I think Donna just did a great job of speaking about all the kind of benefits that we see. So I also want to be clear when I'm referring to multi-generational households, because most of my work focuses on children in particular, I am talking about 3 generations. So I'm actually thinking a grandparent, a parent, and a child in the household, because I'm focusing on children in particular. And so I would say that there's actually some really great research by Hope Harvey, a graduate of this fine institution, qualitative research that interviews the folks who are living in these multi-generational households. And one of the challenges she really highlights is kind of how to navigate or sort of stake the space when you're living with your own parent. How to think about being a parent in that context can be very challenging. And especially if you're living in someone else's home, how can you say, like, this is mine, or these are the decisions I want to make, and how to kind of think about that. So that's one of those sorts of things I think that is important to think about when we're talking about this. There's research that looks at sort of the older generation, actually, that has found, especially on the lower income side, grandparents are more likely to go hungry, actually, to have experienced food insecurity in these households, in part because they want to really they'll forego food in order for their grandchildren to have enough to eat, for instance. And then the last thing I want to sort of say is that in my research and in other research, I think that there's a lot of heterogeneity, I think, is what the bottom line that I think, if there's a message to say, I think everyone has different opinions about this. And so I don't know that it's that easy to sort of say, this is how people feel about these households. But when we look at research from the policy perspective, where we've made expansions in people's sort of independent ability to kind of live independently. So when Social Security rolled out and we had a lot more money became available, people move out of multi-generational households. Now, whether or not that's, why I think that suggests that people have some preference to live in these households. And in my own work, focused on lower income households, when we've expanded the earned income tax credit, which is a tax credit for low income households, what we see is they move out of doubled up households, or sort of living with others, but also in particular multi-generational households. Now, that's an average effect, right? So I want to say that some people really do want to stay and remain in these households. They tend to be pretty short-lived for when it's for children in particular, but I think, those are some of kind of I don't know if those are drawbacks, but it sort of certainly suggests that there's maybe some pushback on whether or not they want to live in these households.
And Natasha, can you speak a little bit to the stability of these households? Because I think that may be one of the features that drive some of these more negative outcomes.
Right, so these are surprisingly hard to nail down, to get the exact estimates, but the best estimates that we have, I think, suggest that they are on average last for about 2.5 years. Let me be clear, again, this is from the perspective of children, so for kids, and part of that is because they move out, right? So maybe this is for a later question, but as just to take it now, is as children age, so about 15% of kids are, when they're under the age of 1, are living in a multi-generational household, and then as children get older, they're less likely to live in one of these households, and that's because I think they move out as people become more economically stable. As you have fewer childcare needs, less assistance, we see that people are less likely to live in these households. So that, in some ways, we would expect them to move out, right? Mm-hmm. But surprisingly, even when the older adult moves into the household with the into the child's household, am I making sense? The grandparents move in with the parents. Those are so actually the same. We see also they last about 2.5 years.
Interesting. I want to bring in Noelle now. Noelle is the founder of Nesterly, which, for those of you who don't know, is an organization that facilitates intergenerational house sharing among people who aren't related. And for all the students in attendance, Noelle's idea for Nesterly began when she was in graduate school and her master's thesis. So I was hoping that Noelle could share a little bit about what you saw that led you to conceive of Nesterly and how Nesterly addresses those needs.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Jennifer, and everyone for having us. And I'm coming from a different perspective. We've had some pre-panel discussions, and it's been so lively because multi-generational housing can be looked at in so many different ways. I'm really focused on unrelated households, so people who didn't know each other before and are living together. So I was just down the street doing my master's in urban planning at MIT, and I had prior experience working in affordable housing construction and policy in New York, and was really interested in where can we find new ideas to create more affordable cities and communities. So I was in the GIS lab working away and figured out that we have over 54 million spare bedrooms sitting empty every night in the United States in occupied homes. And I was just amazed at this. I mean, this is many, many billions of dollars worth of underutilized real estate. And I was like, where are these homes and who's living in them and what's going on? And that led me to Jennifer Molinsky and the amazing work from the Joint Center for Housing Studies on their Housing Older Adults report, and started to peel back the layers and realize that the majority of these spare rooms are in the homes of older adults, that 80 to 90% of adults want to stay in their homes and in their communities as they get older, but face, as Donna was mentioning, financial, social, and oftentimes physical challenges to doing so. And I was really interested, really from like a built environment perspective, how do we leverage this underutilized real estate? And that this was not a trend, a trend that was getting smaller. We are a rapidly aging society. What I learned from Jennifer and the studies is by 2035, half of all older adult households will be single person. About a third today, and you should correct me if I have outdated data, but like about a third today of older adult households are single person. So what does it mean when we have all these older adults living alone in these larger homes? And what kind of opportunity is there to unlock affordable housing? So in Boston alone, we have over 90,000 spare bedrooms sitting empty every night, the majority in older adult homes. So that's how the idea of Nesterly was born. I'm really excited to continue, this conversation and think about how multi-generational households take effect in these unrelated and related ways.
So, Noelle, why was your focus on intergenerational? So you could have thought about other house sharing models, but you really explicitly focused on young people and older homeowners, really, I suspect.
There were two reasons. One is I grew up on a very small island in Canada where there was about 1,000 people, twice the size of Manhattan, and 3 ferries to get to it. There were 3 people in the grade above me in middle school and 6 people in my grade. And in growing up in that community, it was kind of forced, but like if you didn't love the couple of people in your grade that were your age, you started to make friends with people 3 years younger or 15 years older. And every event, every social event had multiple generations there. And it was just the way I grew up, that this was a very natural thing, that you interacted on a daily basis out of necessity. But it was really nice. I mean, I really enjoyed it. And then on the other side, it was just very practical. It was like, we have all this real estate. There's no NIMBYism. There's no zoning. There's no construction costs. There's no $8 billion budget we need to build these new units. They're here. The infrastructure is here. How do we unlock them? Well, it's older adults that have them. And so who are the single people coming to cities who need medium-term housing, who could just live in one room as opposed to families, and who has a space? And it's mostly baby boomers, empty nesters, who have that extra space, and even older who maybe lost a spouse or was divorced. And then people like graduate students at the GSD who are coming here and saying, I need an 8-month place to stay, and I would love to pay $600. This affordability will really make an impact on my life.
And for the older adult, the benefits are the income that they're getting, and can you say a word about the companionship?
Yeah, so for some older adults, there's a range in, I mean, you cited an amazing statistic that only 24% of older adult households in the US can afford both housing and care. So we have some baby boomers who are very comfortable, and we have a lot of people where they go on fixed and limited, fixed incomes, inflation, rising housing, property taxes, rising costs of living, and $600 a month can really make an impact on their quality of life. Some people are more motivated by the social connection, by having an interesting young person in their home. They're used to having their spouse around, or they were used to having young people around, and that can make a big difference. And then we also have the opportunity to, which we'll get later in the program, about care and help. So about 50% of our home shares exchange a little bit of help around the house for a reduction in rent. And so just having someone around, like from the Age Lab, they were talking about, changing a light bulb. Easy, right? One person to change a light bulb. It's actually quite a dangerous thing to do when you're over 60 and you're climbing up a ladder and trying to get to the ceiling. If you have a young person around, you can ask for help in ways where maybe you wouldn't have called a friend or a neighbor or a relative to come help you. You would have tried to do it yourself.
That's great. And Donna, I know that you and Ernest have done some research on home sharing and its benefits. Could you speak to that a bit?
I had the pleasure probably about 10 years ago of starting to work with Dr. Ernest Gonzalez at NYU on trying to understand why this idea of home sharing, intergenerational home sharing, excited a lot of people, but it was only small boutique programs around the country. It had never scaled. And we, being intergenerational advocates, only look at things from an intergenerational solutions lens. So what we thought of is there really were two big issues we wanted to tackle. One was student debt, and the other was older people's desire to age in place, age in their own home. So how could we marry those two using that intergenerational solutions lens and show that the concept would work, and then scale that to the point where we'd be able to work on public policy changes that would support it. So what we found is there's a lot of reasons why it's small boutique programs around the country, and I always have to applaud Noelle because of the, what you've built with grit and determination with Nesterly. A lot of folks think it's a great idea and they'll start a program and they'll find out all the complications. I worked with a number of universities that they got very excited about it, and then they took it to their legal departments, and that put the kibosh on it right away. Fortunately, Ernest was able to start a program at NYU and still runs that 8 years later. It's a small program, but NYU students live with older adults. So what we found is that there was interest in it. Oftentimes for the students, it might relate to their major, whether that be nursing, doctors, social work, whatever. It might relate to their degree program and actually reinforce and get them more excited about what it was that they were studying. And then, of course, for the older adults, as Jen mentioned, generativity, that connection. My aunt, who always has had one of her grandchildren live with her, says that that grandchild is her windows into the future. She loves those conversations that they have. It keeps her knowing what the right word is, all that. I just did an event, and my cousin told me it was sick. And I thought, sick? Sick? And she said, it's a good thing. I said, okay, good. Okay, it was sick. So, it helps you know what the current culture is, but also provides that stability, because for older people, or for younger people, to realize that older people are still learning and growing and can thrive and are curious. People who are around older adults like that fear their own aging less and fear the impact as that occurs. So there just were a lot of different elements. Noelle talked about the financial impact, which is huge, the ability to make the repairs on a home, or to be able to change your light bulbs or have somebody shovel the snow when it snows, really help an older adult stay at home. So we still haven't been able to, unlock the how do you scale this, how do you bring this to scale. There's still a lot of that has to be dealt with that. But I think every day that Noelle is proving that it can work and that it can be a very good thing for a lot of people.
I want to pick up on one theme that Noelle and Natasha we sort of hit on a little bit, but the idea of change over time of the life cycle of a multi-generational household. So you said medium term-ish, and meaning?
Yeah, so we started in Boston, which I'm excited some colleagues are here today that will speak on the panel later, who we started our first program with. We kind of found a sweet spot with medium-term housing. Starting, over 30 days, our average length of stay is about 9 months. So these are people coming to maybe a new city, coming for a program, traveling nurses, a medical residency, and needing an affordable room to rent, or maybe moving to a new town and looking for a job after they've graduated. And then moving on, maybe earning, getting a better paying job, moving to a different neighborhood, changing programs, moving cities, meeting a partner, and moving on. And that has worked really well, I think, with some of the challenges that Natasha's come up with, that there is a start and an end point to this home share. And the hosts, what we call hosts, are the king and queen of their castle. They have a guest coming in and they set the rules. You get, this is your room, this is where you can store things, this is how the kitchen is. They are not going in as equals. You are really a guest in their home. And we had one host who, in Cambridge, one of our first hosts to sign up, and she said, I could live with anyone for 4 months. Anybody. Because you're 2 months in and they have this tick that's really irritating you, it's going to be over in a few months. But we found is 90% of our hosts who home share once sign up to do it again, because they realize this can be a really positive experience, and the kind of stranger danger element to it goes away immediately once you have a real person in front of you.
So can you speak, Natasha, to this life cycle issue and the maybe less planned aspect of related families living together?
Right. So I think, again, I want to be clear that when I'm talking about a multi-generational household, I think in our mind we may still be thinking of the older adult, like the grandparent generation being an older adult, like over 65. And that's, the median age is actually under 65 in multi-generational households. And so many of the people who are, in fact, if you're looking at a very low-income studies, which I have done, at the birth of a child, the grandparent's age is like something like 47. So, right, so these are also very different. And so what we might think of in terms of the stability, it's not surprising that they are shorter lived, I think, maybe than when we're thinking about a multi-generational or intergenerational adults living together, right? So I just kind of want to make that point so that that's clear. That, like I said already, that many of these people move out because as their children age, they become more stable, and there's, I think, a kind of a desire to have more independence, or just, you don't need so much help. But that is not true it's not the same when I think someone comes in and needs care upward in terms of like taking care of the older adult in those households. Those are much more, I think, they're more slightly, I don't think they're maybe necessarily longer lasting, but we do see that it's not really related to the age of the child. There's something else that's going on that's causing those sorts of households. But I think I've lost the train of what you specifically asked me.
No. Not at all. Not at all. I think I'm thinking about, how these households evolve. Like people are aging, children are growing, older adults might need more. What do we know about negotiating those changes through a multi-generational household? And maybe one of the answers is that the multi-generational household doesn't last, through all those changes.
Yeah, and I don't know that we know that much about that, to be very frank, in terms of the evolution over time of these households. This is maybe not exactly answering the question, but I mentioned this when we were talking before, and I think this is worth noting. So I've actually studied this over calendar time. So I've taken the census all the way back to 1890, and if you look at the share of children that are living in multi-generational households, there was like a peak around 1940, and actually we have more children today. 10.6% of all children, or 7.7 million children, living in these households today. So this is a different type of time, right? But if we look back, since 1980, there's been a rise in these households from about 5% to roughly 10% of kids, right? So that's for demographers, which maybe I'm the only one, that's a huge demographic shift. And why that's happening, I don't know exactly. I mean, it might be because people want to, or it might be housing costs is probably a huge driver, and other sort of social safety net changes.
Donna, one special case is grandparents raising grandchildren without the middle generation present. And we have seen models of housing specifically for this demographic, grandparents raising grandchildren. But again, that's a thing where the grandchildren grow up, and then there's what happens. So can you speak a little bit to the grandfamilies and the grandparent housing?
I'd love to do that, but first I want to share a story because when Jen and I first met, you were sharing your report for the German Marshall Fund, and someone from HUD was there and said that the only intergenerational funding for housing available is through something called Legacy. And Legacy was something that Generations United worked on about 25 years ago. And for policy students or public policy students or people that are interested in this, I think it's a wonderful example of how you merge different art forms and different ways of working. There was a documentary film that was made in about 1999 called Legacy. And Legacy was by Todd Lending, who's a very talented storyteller. And what he did was he got funding to follow some of the kids that were successful despite all the odds at Henry Horner Housing Project in Chicago, which, if you remember, that was one of the worst experiments in how you warehouse people with no resources. So he did this documentary of he was going to follow these 6 young people who were succeeding. The first family he talked with, he met the young man and then was talking with his grandmother, and 8 hours later the young man was shot and killed. So what he did was turn the film from following the success of these kids to following the family and how they grappled with substance abuse, with single parents, with poverty, all of that, and told the story through one of the teenage daughters' eyes and voice. So Legacy became a very powerful film about resiliency. The family, substance abuse, up, down, but the family was able to, with some help, get out of the projects and into their own home. And then Nikki, the teenager, is a mother now and the first person in her family to get a college degree and teaches in the Chicago school district. So it was a great success story. So we wanted to build and use that to change policy. So teeing off of Legacy, we worked with Champions on the Hill and introduced potential legislation called Legacy, Living Equitably, Grandparents Aiding Children and Youth. and we worked on different provisions, and eventually it was incorporated into the American Dream Down Payment Act that George Bush wanted desperately to have signed into law. And so it was included in that, and to this day is still the only intergenerational opportunity through HUD funding. We thought it sunsetted, but just last year there was another $10 million that was allocated for it. So it is funded, technically, officially, it's funded about 4 projects around the country. But there are over half a dozen and close to a dozen projects that are in development. And so what Jen was asking about are these grand families housing, grandparent housing. And they are scattered about the country. The more recent ones have been designed so that they're created for people of all ages. For example, they might be built around a play area so that the grandparent can sit in their apartment and see their children. They're built with social service supports, with a room for the teenagers, a room for the children to play, and a room for support groups for the older adults. So they're designed around the families. But also the families are dynamic and they age. And so in Smithville, Tennessee, which has one of the first legacy supported housing, it's about 8 units in this tiny town in Tennessee. And it was built next to a senior living facility, a block away. So as the children age out, the grandparents move a block away. So they're still in the same neighborhood, the same area. Some have played with the concept of how do you adjust the size for the apartment as the children may leave. It may go from a 2-bedroom or from a 3-bedroom to a 2-bedroom to a 1-bedroom, and you're able to, to continue to support the family. So looking at that flexible space. So there are different ways that folks have tried to do that, but tried to make sure that it's not disruptive. It's been advantageous in terms of traditional 202 senior-only housing doesn't allow children. And we would hear stories over and over about grandparents taking their children in and being terrified that they were going to lose their apartment. So one grandmother would always, whenever there was a knock at the door, the children were given a cookie and they stayed in the closet. And then finally, when it was safe, they could come out of the closet. She was finally caught and she was evicted. But basically, it's developing housing so it's supportive and understanding of different demographics and family structures.
So I think that 2 interesting aspects that you just raised are the flexible physical house and the flexibility of programming to adapt to, I think I agree with what you said, Natasha. Looking at data does not give you an idea of the fluidity of households and how they change so often, between data waves. There might have been multiple changes, right? So this is really important. So I want to touch on both. Let's start with the physical house. How might design support multi-generational households better? Where would you begin? Anyone?
I mean, just throwing out one stat from you guys is that, one is, I didn't get to mention, and many people here hopefully know because they're reading the Joint Center for Housing, every report that comes out of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, but older adults are our fastest growing population in the United States. This has a huge impact and is having, and will continue to have a huge impact on our built environment. And you'll update me, but it's around 3 to 4% of our homes in America today are actually designed and people are able to age in those homes. We do not have enough nursing homes for the population that are becoming seniors in this country. So we need to come up with more housing typologies and solutions for people to be able to stay in their homes if that's what they want to do. So the question was around, how do we adapt these homes? And I think there's some interesting legislation. Everybody's talking about ADUs. I was recently asked to speak at the Oregon State Legislature around a program. They were trying to create a grant program to have interior accessory dwelling units. So what can we do for these larger homes that might not accommodate a family or a couple moving in, where they can give them these forgivable loans to add a kitchen or add a bathroom downstairs? So these older adults that want to stay in a larger home where they raise their family can make a few small adaptations and have some government support to do that, on the condition that they rent them to a long-term tenant, that the rent is affordable, and having the right policy sort of parameters around the design can really help us adapt our existing infrastructure to make this an easier solution and a more accessible solution to more people.
I think those are, really good ideas, Noelle. I want to push back on the nursing home thing, though, because most adults, one of the issues. Thank you. Thank you. Most older adults don't want to end up in a nursing home, especially the way that nursing homes are traditionally built and how they're staffed and everything. Now, there are, the senior housing industry is realizing that they have to adapt, and they have to adapt to the way that people are aging now. And so they're behind. They're very much behind in making sure that there's something that somebody
Oh, yes,
desires.
I agree. I just meant we don't have enough. People don't want to go there. We don't have enough, and they're too expensive.
And then I think that, to your point, that one of the things is that we too often think of age-friendly solutions, whether it's for babies or for older adults. And what we have to realize is those solutions should work for whether you're in a baby carriage or wheelchair. However you are, that accessibility aspect for people in housing is what helps them to be able to stay in those houses, helps them to be able to pass on those houses. So it's to be able to make sure that we're building so that it's accessible for people of all ages. And then I think your point about making sure that housing is the financing, that sort of thing. What we've found from families that want to come together or buy a house is that there are limitations on the ways that banks will do loans. There's the number of signatures that they'll allow. There's the number of resources they'll allow. And the same with insurance. If you get an insurance policy and it only allows for the homeowner, but you have 2 or 3 homeowners. So it's getting down to some of that local and not just public policy, but other kinds of policy as well.
And Natasha, in terms of the physical house, sort of taking it from a different perspective, I have read a little bit about crowding and sort of the influence of crowding on the outcomes, and I imagine that in some of these doubled up situations, that's an inevitable reality.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is part, I don't know anything about physical structure, so let me just put that out there. But I was thinking about public policies a little bit too, right? And thinking about how we might address this in the public housing sort of space where you're not allowed to double up, for instance. But I'm actually torn about whether or not we would want to change that policy or not, because we know that it's not that great to live in crowded situations. There's quite a bit of evidence that, at least for children, right, this can be very disruptive. If an adult is coming into this house that they may or may not know, and not all adults are great, and that can cause a lot of issues for children. And also we know that crowding in terms of like just even having a space to study and be on top of your homework and those sorts of things, or the noise levels that happens, or even having a bed, right? So children have to be the ones who are to sort of vacate the space for other people who come in. And so I would say that, it's hard to think about it. That said, when people want to also give a hand to their families and their friends who are in need. If you are in a public housing unit or in public housing in general, right, you're not allowed to. And so I guess maybe the solution is we need more public housing.
Some fans. And Donna, I think that was why that Tennessee example is so interesting, the idea that you could have apartments that can go from 3-bedroom to 2-bedroom to, like closing off. I don't know how they do it, but that's a fascinating example because then no one is forced to move. Yeah.
Well, they're not forced to move from an area they don't know, because we were talking earlier about choice and about, multi-generational living isn't for everybody, but it is for a number of people. And oftentimes why older adults will say they don't want it is because it means them leaving the neighborhood, the community where they know people, where they know how to get around, where they have their Mahjong class or their Tai Chi class or whatever, and uprooting them and putting them in a home in a neighborhood that they don't know anybody. And so that can be, just, again, choice and making sure that people have that opportunity. And then I think to your point, too, the issue that we found with multi-generational families is the number one stressor is space. It's not having enough space for alone time and together time. And so that really makes a difference.
I want to touch on policy and then go to care, and then we'll open it up for questions. So we just talked about the physical house, but there are clearly policies that are impediments to intergenerational housing, especially, Noel, with non-related people. Could you speak a little to that?
Yeah. So just to mention, I wrote my master's thesis on the idea after realizing that there were 54 million spare bedrooms sitting empty every night, and then this turned into my full-time job and career. So I think there's a big opportunity here in this space for designers and planners and entrepreneurs that we really need a lot more innovation and new ideas. On the policy side, it's completely legal in most places to do this, which is rent out a room in your home. There are some archaic laws around unrelated people. So I think in New York City, it's still like you can't have 2 or more unrelated people sharing an apartment. Clearly, this is not enforced. We've never had this come up in our work in partnering with cities, even if these archaic laws do exist, because they're worried about it turning into a brothel or something. But we do see it come up in other ways. For instance, in Washington State, where we're working, they passed a law that prevents HOAs from limiting or regulated how many unrelated people live in that housing association. And this can have a big impact on people who think they have the ability to make this choice, and then they find out their HOA prevents it. There's a few other things that we're seeing other countries doing that I think is really inspiring, that's more incentivizing this type of behavior, because in our case with unrelated people and overhoused older adults, that this has a really positive benefit on the whole community. So if you think about Cambridge, really anywhere, we're able to increase the supply of housing. And so if we're having students moving in with overhoused older adults, then those apartments that students might be taking are now opened up, and we're overall increasing the housing supply. There's also an anti-gentrification element beyond the environmental element. But in the UK, the income for older adults who are doing this is not taxed. So they created a policy, let's not punish people and tax this really positive behavior that's creating new affordable housing at no cost to the government. There's other regulations where that's going to be harder to pass, but the more momentum and political will that we can build is like landlord-tenant laws. There's been a lot of protection for tenants, which is, I think, very positive on the whole as a society, but to treat a single older woman who's renting out a room in her home the same as a commercial landlord who's renting out an entire apartment and having the same procedures related to landlord and tenant protection just really scares people away from doing this. So how do we add a bit more nuance to landlord-tenant laws to recognize that this is a viable way of living in your home?
And for families, Natasha, what could help? What kind of supports do you envision that would make more positive outcomes more likely?
Do I get all the money in the world? I think we need, as a public policy person, I think we need policies around caregiving that are actually supportive of families, but on both ends, right? So the child care and the upward care. And I think I've mentioned this before, one of the kind of, when we think about multi-generational living, families are amazing. They really provide supports in so many different ways. It could be caregiving, it could be economics, it can be so many things. But that the government, my fear is that the government is relying on families to do this and step in place of the public policies that we should be putting in place. And then in particular, there's a gendered piece of this. There's a sociologist who wrote a book basically that women are the social safety net. And in many ways, I think, that this can play out if you're thinking about this in the multi-generational space, if we sort of rely on over-reliance on this, I think. Without public policy supports in place, it will be the women who take on all this work. They already are, right? Let's be honest. But they're maybe even more so, is my fear.
Yeah, and that really was the last issue I wanted to touch on, which is that pulling that care into the home really we're kind of reinforcing the idea that is a private duty. It's not a government safety net role. And we see a lot of pressure to do that, not just because care is expensive, but because, well, I mean, let's face it, people would probably rather receive care in their home than in a hospital. And we have acute care happening in people's homes now that wouldn't have happened in the past. But it does make it the responsibility of the family and not the larger public. So I think one of the things that we have to look out for as we perhaps try to make things better for multi-generational families is that we don't inadvertently make it seem that we don't need these other supports. Right? Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to mention that with grandparents raising grandchildren, the most recent number is they save our country $10.5 billion a year in care because the kids are kept out of the foster care system and out of those. But what we say is that the families can be and are very successful with support. Again, it goes back to that. You don't plop a child down and then say it's all going to be great. But one of the things, and this is a totally selfish plug, I have a new book coming out in June on grand families. This is really told from the stories of the families and the adult children themselves. And, so much of the story is that they can be successful, they are successful, but also what it does is it shows the policy and perception change over the last 25, 30 years. And when we think about some of the things that we're talking about and the solutions we're talking about, they're not going to happen immediately. It takes a long-term commitment and a long-term plan. Because when we first started in this field, it was the whole apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Why should we support or give money to a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt when they screwed up in the first place? And as a grandparent told me, she said, if an apple falls out of a tree, we don't throw it away. We make apple pie, apple sauce, apple juice. We save that apple. And why aren't we doing that for children? And why aren't we providing the support so that the relatives can be successful in raising those children? So we've made some progress, but there's a whole lot more to go, and there's a whole lot more to go with multi-generational families.
Thank you. I want to open it up to questions, and we have some colleagues with mics who will be happy to. Why don't we start back there, and then we'll come up to Jenny.
Thank you. Great panel. My name's Ann Doyle, and my question is around, I love this concept of using underutilized assets like bedrooms and homes, and my work involves using underutilized campuses, college campuses around the country, and thinking about integrating in older adults, either on campus or adjacent to campuses, or being a part of that community. You asked some great questions about what are the impediments that you perceive, and I would really love to hear from each of you what you see as the impediments to really thinking differently about how we use college campuses, some that have extra land, some that have land adjacent, or partnerships in creating those connections, multi-generational connections. Thanks.
That's terrific. One of the areas that really excites me is we're seeing more and more interest in integrating older adults into college campuses. And there's some terrific examples. Purchase in New York opened up a senior housing complex there. And it's a good study in terms of how difficult and how complex it was in terms of the funding, but also because it was state land. And they dealt with this also at Marabella at Arizona State University. It's state-owned land. And so the state wasn't going to let a for-profit developer of senior housing come on and profit from that. So they had to work out different arrangements. And what they finally came to terms with at Purchase is that they pay X amount of money, the senior housing pays X amount of money to the university for use of that land. But all that money goes for student scholarships and teacher salaries. So they found some ways of trying to work around that. But there are different examples where they're actually in converting dorms, building new developments. We have somebody that's focused on historically black colleges and universities, because most of the ones that have been developed so far are higher end. And so how do you actually integrate more of an affordable housing or market rate housing into the campuses? So that's just a couple of examples.
Have either of you, no, okay, no worries. No, I mean, no, you really started with the idea of students, so it seems like there's.
Yeah, I mean, we started in Cambridge when I was still a student at MIT, and we weren't thinking about underutilized land here because there's not a lot of underutilized land.
Right.
And I think I was just really excited about getting universities on board. It was quite easy because there's public relations with the community. And when you really are pitched to the universities, where like, you really want the local community to not feel displaced by students moving in temporarily. How do they benefit from having this seasonal influx of students here? And how do you build social and community resiliency and build anti-gentrification tools, which is how do we help the people that have been here for a long time be able to remain here? And I think that was a really compelling story for Cambridge around better integration of the university within this community fabric that already exists.
And the models that that our guests were just talking about, bring older adults to the campus and have them engage in the campus life. So that's, yeah, it's two sides of the coin. Jenny, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this amazing first panel. And maybe this is just to pick up on the demographers in the room. And Natasha and Noelle, you both brought up both the silver tsunami, which David and Chris taught me about long ago, but the oncoming older population being really dominant in the U.S. And Natasha, you also called to the demographers, but we just, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, we had an update in the U.S. on birth rates, right? And that the birth rate is also declining as single-person households. I know this is a sort of foggy thing.
I have lots of thoughts.
Yes. Oh, I mean, so maybe I just wanted to put a finer point on if the private household does become the social safety net, but in fact, actually, the links between and the sizes of those households are demonstrably shrinking, how the kind of housing environment becomes another form of constructing families and producing that social safety net at the same time, which obviously is embedded in all of this. But I just wanted to maybe get an opinion on, declining marriage and birth rates, not to be bringing neocon to the table here in any way, shape, or form. I'm just...
Okay.
Is it
okay if I start? Okay, so as the demographer, I have lots of opinions about, right, the latest is everyone's not going to have, so we still think that people are having babies, let me just be clear, and I think they think they're having them later, right? So part of this is just that there's a delay in sort of fertility timing, that there's not a huge, there is a decline though, I'm not trying to say there isn't, but also, lately we don't have immigration. So if you undo the changes in immigration laws, you can, if you think that the declining fertility rate is a problem, you can fix this. So I just sort of want to put this out there as like as the academic demographers are less worried about this phenomenon, I think, than the political folks who are kind of focused on this. And so I guess then that raises the question of, I do think we should think differently about our communities for sure. I mean, I think we should do that regardless of whether or not there are no babies being had, and sort of how we should do that. I think that's very important. But I do think that I guess I want to say I don't think there's as much of it. We don't need to be people are still going to get married too. Like, it happens, it's just they're doing it later. But we don't need to be in too much crisis yet.
I thought Elon Musk was single-handedly handling that problem. But one of the positive aspects is that teenage pregnancy is down in our country, and I think that's something that we should, those of us that worked in that area should be, kind of go yay on that. And the immigration piece is very important. All you have to do is look at Japan, where you've got 74-year-olds, 84-year-olds taking care of 104-year-olds because they never allowed a younger population or immigration in their country. The thing that we've been talking about built environment and housing and space, but all of our policies related to older adults need to be refined to keep up with the fact that people are living longer, they're living healthier, they don't want to be put behind gates in a senior-only community, they don't want to be in a nursing home, they want to be vitally connected to a campus, to college life, to have purpose, and to be able to be generative. So we need to look at things like our workplace policy. We have to look at things like, how we deal with healthcare in this country. We incentivize being sick, not being well. And so what are the things that we can do, that we can address to try to make sure that that aging population is the asset that it really can be?
Oh, lots of questions. We'll go to Paige, and then we'll go over to Lydia.
Thank you, and thank you all for the panel. I wanted to ask a question about intergenerational home sharing and the, whether or not parties are related or unrelated. So something that we found in Boston piloting intergenerational home sharing is that there were many more renters seeking that affordable rent than there were homeowners who had that, there's no doubt that they're overhoused seniors, but the number of seniors who were willing to open up their homes to someone who they didn't know was significantly smaller. So what are the, Noelle, I'm dying to know, how has Nesterly's work, where are you finding success with this model? How are you helping homeowners become more comfortable with this? How has the work evolved since Boston?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And that's where some of what we already discussed, but also we can double down on this, is how do we, there's a shift in culture that needs to happen. I mean, we have lived in multi-generational families and households since the beginning of time. This is one of the oldest ideas out there, and it's actually our more contemporary history where we don't live this way. So there's a long history of boarding houses in the US, where at one point, half of all urban dwellers in the United States lived in a boarding or rooming house, which was a single room with communal shared bathrooms and kitchens, and it was an affordable place to stay when you moved to a new community. So this is really an old idea that we're saying, let's come back to this. The demographic side of it is that about 70% of older single households are female-led. Women tend to live longer. They tend to not get remarried if they're divorced or widowed, and they have about half the household wealth as a single older male. So that's where there's the largest growth and interest on our side in this specific type of unrelated intergenerational home sharing are with single older women. Where we're seeing, policies around landlord-tenant laws have a big impact, things related to benefits and uncoupling a roommate's income from the older household's income so that they don't lose access to the benefits that they're getting. So these somewhat nuanced or quirky policy conversations are actually really critical to making this solution available. We're seeing in California, we've seen Portland just announced last month, they're giving the city of Portland has budgeted money to give $1,000 to every older host who's opening up a new room in their home, and then $500 for another room. So what are the levers? This is worth so much more than $1,000 to the city of Portland to have a new unit of affordable housing being created in their town. So how can we keep investing in this, in telling the positive stories that we're seeing every day about this working really well? And then let's dig into the real policy levers that we have that are making people scared to do this and not as confident in doing this. If you can't ask someone to leave your home and you have to go through a year-long eviction process, people are just less willing to do this. And then we at Nesterly, we're trying to make it safe and easy. So we handle the leasing, we do background checks, we do check references, we have a social worker who's helping people. So we need to invest in programs like what I'm doing to make it really accessible for people that want to do it but wouldn't just go to Craigslist and do this on their own. So it's a really safe option for people.
Thank you.
Before we go to Lydia and then the gentleman behind her, 2 editorial comments. I will take the liberty of making one. My colleague Samara just wrote a blog you can find on our website about older single women and the economic challenges that they face in particular. And 2, I will say we've talked about overhoused, which is a term that I'm never quite sure about as someone who studies older adults who might have extra space, because we know that people might be using that space in a different way, right? They might be, my own parents have an extra bedroom for when we come to visit, for example. So the numbers that you just cite are very striking about the potential, but maybe one of the reasons is that some of those bedrooms are already put to use, as we talked about before. But yeah, just wanted to throw that out there. But Lydia, you have a question. Right in front of you, David. There you go.
Hi, thank you so much. It's so great to hear from the 4 of you. So something I've been thinking a lot about is how there's a bit of a tension between studying multi-generational housing by necessity and building and marketing multi-generational housing by design. And I do think that there's a bit of a difficulty and a challenge of kind of acknowledging that space in the middle, where we talk about a lot of these really attractive opportunities for adults with a lot of decision-making power to maybe choose to live in a multi-generational household when there are many adults that just end up having to do it because there's no other option. And I guess maybe this is mostly a question for Noelle, but kind of trying to acknowledge and not gentrify the concept of kind of how this happens. I'd love to hear a little bit more.
Yes, I mean, I think like we've found this in our pre-panel discussions. Like there's so many different elements here. Like there's the 3 generations living together, not by choice, but by necessity. I'm looking at this huge population that are living alone, far away from their families, with more than 1 extra room in their home. And then we're also talking about new construction, which is really exciting. And I think my focus has been more on like adapting the existing home and kind of working with what we have today in that existing structure versus, which I think is also exciting, the new construction possibilities of like, how do we imagine spaces that can get larger and smaller, and how do we build more intentional homes that make it really is honestly easier to not share everything in the home. So maybe you could have your own little kitchen, but you share the laundry room. There's less friction and there's less adaptation to having a roommate if there's a bit more infrastructure within the home. But we have people sharing 2-bedroom apartments with a shared bathroom, and that's also something going on. But I don't know what else I have to add.
I'll just say, I think that this panel was the trickiest one for us to think about because I think we're going to hear from the second panel sitting in front of me that the intentional communities, you pretty much always choose to live in them. And in this case, we've got choice and we've got necessity, and the implications are vastly different in the outcomes and the situation. So, but it is a phenomenon, and it's happening in both these ways, both the intentional and the necessity and the related and the unrelated. But so I think we've covered a lot here, trying to tease this out. But apologies if it's been weaving a bunch of things together that are a bit different. It's just that this is the level of the household, right? And Donna, why don't you?
I was just, I think you're very right. I was just going to add that if you've not seen it, I would really encourage you to look at a blueprint that we did together called Healthier Lives Across Generations, a blueprint for intergenerational living. And a big purpose of that was because if you have money, you can do anything you want. You can build a multi-generational household. You can do whatever you want. And if you are in senior-only, restricted HUD housing, you have not a whole lot of options. But there's this whole missing middle, and there's people, how do we make sure that there's opportunity and options for them? So that's what we tried to look at, is what do we need to change so that we can make this available to people who want it, and so we looked at, increasing the research and the evidence. We looked at the messaging, because we've touched on this, that there's this stigma about living together that we really have to push back on, because we stigmatized it, and we shouldn't do that, and we can change that over time. But it was also policy and funding, as well as practice, capturing what's working, what's helping to make this happen in communities. So those are just a couple things.
And I do think we have tied it together in some of our conversations about choice, right? That this is yet another option that we can promote for our housing, for our living situations, that can address a bunch of problems for certain people, for people who are inclined that way. Right behind Lydia. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Gray Lee, and I come from an intentional boarding house a couple of blocks away, an old-fashioned urban land trust that bought a place in 1963 and is still going. My question is about, and maybe it's coming up in the next one, but it's about conflict management and governance within these multi-generational households. I'm curious about research into patterns of governance and conflict resolution that support the duration of these households staying together, and reflecting on, yes, we've had intergenerational households for centuries, millennia, but those were generally very, unitary, male, patriarch dominant structures. And I'm sure there's other examples, but we know in this country it's been that way. And so I'm wondering, in what ways do we see organic development of governance structures in these types of households that can mitigate some of the challenges that the state social safety net backing things up do respond to when any type of household falls apart or disperses. So I'm curious to hear about any research on that topic, and not necessarily from Nesterly, but just in the realm of public housing or shared housing. Thank you.
I'm sure the other folks have something to add to this. With intergenerational home sharing at NYU, it's done through the School of Social Work, and social workers, social work students are very involved to help support the match, should there be any conflict that comes up, and check in on and that sort of thing. So with that project, that's how that's done. There's a whole tip sheet and things that we've done on multi-generational living on the Generations United website. And one of the first things that we talk about is our family meetings and contracts. Because when you say, families should just be able to live together and live together well, there shouldn't be any conflict, nobody's going to have any problems. No. So you need to have it very clear, like, is this meant to be a permanent situation? Is it meant for just 1 year because somebody's saving for school? Is it meant for this? Is it meant for that? What are the financial responsibilities? Because that's where you get stressed too. Just like with a married couple, the number one reason for divorce is, finance. And so with a family, it's having those clear conversations, laying out the rules of the house, and then regular family meetings to revisit that agreement, that contract, because things change. And one of the things that we would hear about from some of the students who didn't want to be in home sharing was that they were worried about mission creep, that the older person was going to age, that they may be walking their dog, but then the next thing they knew, they were going to have to be taking the dog to the vet, they were going to have to be bathing the dog, they were going to be, providing care for the dog because the dog was getting old. So mission creep was what really got some of the students like, I don't want to do that. So I think the communication is critical, and don't think it's just sweet and nice, that it's just great, we're together. You need to be very concrete.
I'll only add that in our work on Germany, co-housing in Germany, and some of the models that we looked at here, there was a lot of technical assistance available to help the organizers develop their governance plan and structure, because it was so important and it took a long time to negotiate and to get there.
And residence councils.
Yeah.
But I think the challenge is with families, right? We don't have these social norms around the multi-generational households in particular. We don't have norms around kind of laying out what the rules are going to be before you move in together. And I don't know how you shift social norms, and I don't know of any research specifically on that in particular. Certainly, perhaps someone in here would like to do it. But I think that is, like we were talking before, and we have norms around when a couple moves in together. There's norms around, there's even things like if you're going to get married, you take classes, right? Some people take classes, right, before they get married to kind of navigate those spaces, and we don't do that in other situations. But often these houses are formed very quickly, and like I said, especially I study poverty, so children, it's fast, it's neat. If the alternative is homelessness, move in together, right? And so I don't know how you set those up, but that's an interesting, certainly important challenge.
Yeah, one more over here.
Hi, my name is Samuel. Thank you so much for the panel discussion. This has been really fruitful. I had a question surrounding demographics and culture with multi-generational housing. So there are two that I wanted to bring attention to. I am part of the LGBTQ plus community, as obvious from my nose piercings. But I wanted to, the idea of chosen family and I even checked out your Nesterly website while we were sitting here, that you have an LGBTQ plus friendly filter for people to look through. I think that's a very important factor in, it's very common for people like me to have older adults that are not related to us by blood that we do engage with and have conversations with and sometimes live with. And I'm thinking about the Star House Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson created in New York City, and some of the lessons learned from that, where they were doing tutoring and education and childcare for their housing, a lot of younger trans folks. And then the second one is around Oxford housing and sobriety and sober living communities. So Oxford houses have been around for 50 years, and they do rent by the week, and it's quite cheap. And at some points, there's 15 people living in the house, right? And I'm curious, based on shelter housing, the historic precedent I just mentioned, as well as some of the policies and history behind sober living and multi-generational housing, how do you leverage those precedents as a way to kind of push this narrative that multi-generational housing can work? Thanks.
We did not look at those precedents directly, but I'm really glad that you looked at the website. I think that when I was writing my master's thesis, I traveled to Europe and went to the World Home Sharing Congress and talked to people all over the world. I think most of the world is aging rapidly from a demographic perspective, and also having a huge housing crisis in places all around the world. So we did look at a lot of different models and contexts for how this could work, and tried to figure out what the best practices were. I think going back to what Donna said, like upfront communication was the biggest kind of insight we got from research and talking to programs that had been running for a long time, is a lot of people, even unrelated people, would prefer not to talk about things before you move in. And so a big kind of a big benefit of working with a established program is we say, okay, you might not think you have any house rules, but what do you think about overnight guests? Are friends able to come over? Can you store things outside of your bedroom? Obviously smoking and drinking. And so getting people to force them to really imagine, what does it mean to have a person in my home? And they might say, no policy, no policy, no policy, but we're really holding their hand and thinking through this. But I think that there's a lot of amazing stories of immigrant communities coming to a new city and connecting with a church and finding a place to live through established networks and through some common connection in their life, and that's something that we want to build upon and expand.
Yeah, thank you. We are about it. Is it a quick question, or? Go ahead, one more quick question. See, I told you we were ahead of time, and now I'm gonna.
Hi, my name's Kedrick Pfizer. I'm from Houston, Texas. My question was more for the demographer and Noel, and it's about like how I just blanked on my question. I'm just very curious about the demographics of like when you talk about certain people in the certain audience, like who are you referencing when you say this? Like, are you talking about all Americans? Because you're also separating, I would say, Americans versus the like immigrant population. So like who specifically are you directing it towards when you talk about the multifamily or multi-generational households?
I mean, when I'm talking about it, I mean all Americans, immigrant or not, doesn't matter. I mean, okay, I don't mean to say that there aren't residents, people who are living in the United States who would end up in a census count, which should be everybody.
Right.
But I think what you're hinting at is perhaps that there are differences in the prevalence across different, say, racial ethnic groups.
Yes.
Which is absolutely true, of course, yes. And so the people who are the least likely to co-reside or live in a multi-generational household are white households. So like I just gave you the estimate of about 10.6% of kids live in a multi-generational household. It's about 7% of white kids. It's closer to 15% across all racial ethnic groups that are non-white. Slightly higher for Asian Americans, even higher for Native Americans.
And how does that relate to the single women? Because I feel like because you mentioned single women and it's categorizing certain groups of people. So I feel like it would potentially categorize the housing, right? And towards having...
Right, so those are older adults, which are single older adults, which is a slightly different demographic population, which maybe you know the answer to, of the sort of differently.
But yeah, this is census, coming from census data of single older adult women that live in the United States.
Right, and it's been really fascinating to have this panel and to prepare across all these different issues and to talk to Natasha about, she's looking at it from the child perspective, and we look at it from the older adult perspective, and we look at it 65 and over, and 20% of people are living in a multi-generational setting. It is higher among Hispanic and Asian households, lowest among white households, and even in whose household people live has some variance as well, whether it's the adult child or the older adult. So there's clearly some differences.
And last follow-up question, are there any hot spots across like America in terms of like states that you see this happening the most?
Yeah, I think Dan, sitting right next to you, my colleague, could probably talk to you about on the break about this. But we do see more multi-generational living in places where there are more Hispanic households, for instance, more Asian households, and higher housing prices. So that's Hawaii. Okay. Well, that has the highest housing prices in the country.
And I would just add that we started in very urban, like high cost housing cities like Boston, and I was in New York for a long time before moving to Boston, and we're now expanding to very rural communities, very small towns, and they're facing a lot of the same challenges. The housing costs might not seem as high to us coming from New York or Boston, but they're unaffordable unaffordable for people living there. So we're really excited to now be expanding into more rural communities and seeing that there's a great need for this, for seasonal housing, for students coming in, and an aging population there as well.
Well, thank you all. If you please join me in thanking this amazing panel. We now have a 15-minute break. Please, we'll reassemble here at 2:45. So please enjoy some refreshments.
So we're going to step up now to a different scale. The conversation we were having in that first wonderful panel had to do with a single home and that home being shared by people of several generations. Now we're going to talk about buildings. What happens when a group of people in the same building, and I consciously want to leave that a little bit amorphous about what that building looks like, because we're joined by 4 architects up here this morning. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're in a design school after all. So the question now is, we're going to assume that a group of people have decided to live in a place in some sense together. and they have made that choice. And now the question is there a role for design in making it possible for those individuals who live in that building to become a community? Obviously, a lot of that work is done by the individuals themselves in their conversations, in their activities, in their events together. But is there any way for design to make it easier for that to happen or make it harder for it to happen? And so we have 4 architects here, each of whom have done some work in this field, and they're going to talk to us a little bit about how design can influence the building of community. And I'm going to do if it's all right with you guys, I'm going to do a quick introduction of these people, and you can search on the web for more information about them if you'd like to do that. We'll go in this order. Here's Jenny French, who's a professor here at the GSD of Architecture and runs a firm with her sister. Yeah? I just love it. It's called French 2D. Jenny French, and I presume 2D has to, no, that's what's happening, okay. Next is Jonathan Evans, who's an architect and a principal at Mass Design, a creative architectural firm here in Boston that's done work all over the world, and Jonathan has begun to explore this issue of shared homes. Then Rafi Siegel, who is a professor at the tech school down the road, and has also been exploring with his own architectural firm this idea of the kind of housing we're talking about today. And finally, Wandy Pasquale. Oh, God, my French is so terrible. Wandy works for the Boston Society of Architects, our professional association here in Boston that gathers the interests of professional architects. She's trained as an architect herself, and she has worked on their on some of their competitions and some of their award programs. So, Jenny, let's begin with you. And these folks have got some slides to show us about some of their work, and we'll begin to talk about how design can impact the building of a community in an intergenerational home.
Okay, this thing is on. Excellent. Forgive me, I'm losing my voice. So we will just pass the mic down the line. But thank you so much, Jim. Jim also has a co-housing community of his own that's a ground up. I am speaking about this 30-unit co-housing community in Malden, right off of the Orange Line, 1,000 feet from Malden Center. It's called Bay State Co-Housing. It's a project that is about 50,000 square feet, designed in collaboration with its future residents who also developed it. And so here you see from the top left, the group of residents and their late co-housing consultant, a series of 12 day-long workshops in which we kind of did soup to nuts. And then through the process of that design, getting into needing to have a new co-housing zoning ordinance written for the city of Malden. And if we just look at some of the highlighted text here, this exact question of, this building was built during a building moratorium, or right after a building moratorium. And if I go back for just a second, it was only possible after the city of Malden had actually downzoned to, instead of a 4-story max, a 3-story in this business residential office district, and had a kind of cumbersome density limit. So we actually had to redesign the project from 4 stories to 3 stories, 4 years into its process. And even that didn't quite fit the bill. So in fact, we worked with a local city councilor who had lived in cooperative housing when he was an undergraduate at Berkeley, and sort of reached out along with this incredible community of future residents and developers to get a motion for the broader community as co-housing zoning ordinance written, which stipulates specifically, 15% of the gross floor area has to be shared spaces. Those shared spaces have to be continuous and able to accommodate the congregation of basically all of the residents. And most importantly, it has to have a written agreement of its association. In other words, its own governance model that would have to be filed, with the city of Malden itself. So this project is an urban co-housing project on 3/4 of an acre of land. And typically, Jen mentioned there's about 160 of these co-housing communities in the US, based on a very specific model from Denmark and Scandinavia in general in the 1970s. And here, 30 units and what is known as the common house had to be compactly kind of put together into a single figure rather than their more typical configuration, which is sort of in connected but separate buildings with a common house at the center. So here in a plan study and in a model of that same plan, you see the kind of proportional distinction between the parts of the common house, again here in a dotted line, and the individual units that kind of make up the major parts to the whole. And so constantly in this project, we were kind of moving between common kitchens, living rooms, dining rooms, kids spaces, yoga rooms, music rooms, and how the sort of scalar shift between the intimacy of an encounter between these neighbors and kind of extended family by choice in places, that would accept the shy to the neurodivergent, right? We all fall into our different sort of Myers-Briggs categories that actually accommodated all of those personality types. And so the one joy of this project was designing the actual, soup to nuts design process with the residents, which was all through a consensus model, very similar to a Quaker meeting, in which, essentially everyone, we had to kind of come to a resolution. And if someone was moved to speak, here you see coded maybe in red Post-it notes with an objection, we would air the kind of concerns and try to get to a resolution before we could move forward. So what you see really on the left is a series of model studies in elevation showing a single building that at the front reads as a sort of rambling set of gable forms, quite common in this neighborhood that's sort of broached between larger kind of commercial buildings, a Richardsonian Romanesque building, and single-family houses. And its back, which is an open cascading set of courtyard volumes that you see here in section. So this sort of open stepping building is then able to accommodate, again, these moments of kind of nested intimacy here at the main stair, a window into the children's room, which looks directly onto the kitchen, but is a kind of seat for people who are on either side of that wall, or one of the approximately 25 exterior entries off of that central courtyard. The project also, was at a very tight budget, about $260 a square foot, which is actually quite low. And it included, these kind of moments of custom design, like the sound panels in the kitchen ceiling that approximate dinner tables, and always then sort of nesting within this stack section kind of views into and around negotiating moments of encounter. And so when we had our preparatory conversation, we were really talking about sort of design for mutualism. And so sort of foundational to this project is that a series of nested views are always producing peripheral awareness, so that the other residents that are in your chosen community here, approximately 70 to 80 of them, you're aware when they're coming and going, and that the kind of core of this courtyard house is really the foundation of the sort of social fabric. So this took 7 years, sort of start to finish, and was, if you're old enough, like the game Oregon Trail, people came and went. There's, babies were born, etc. And I'm going back. Sorry.
Awesome, thank you.
I apologize.
Any dysentery or anything like that?
No dysentery.
Okay, great.
Happy to report. COVID, though, and a construction moratorium and a budget and mortgage rate increases that almost sank the whole thing.
All right. And with that segue, so I am here to talk about, firstly, with the Treehouse Foundation. Now, the Treehouse Foundation is a community building organization that really creates this idea of intentional intergenerational communities, tackling 3 challenges simultaneously: our child welfare system, providing support for our aging populations, and issues of affordable housing. So their model provides healing and permanency for kids in the foster care system, as well as vital resources for seniors to age with purpose. You can see here some pictures of their existing campus in East Hampton, just sort of a little bit of how you can see people thriving in this community. Now, just looking a little bit more specifically again, so they have an existing community in East Hampton. It's about a 10-acre site, 66 units on scattered buildings with one central community building at its core. What exists here is this model of reciprocity, this idea of, yes, the Treehouse Foundation provides servicing, but they also provide this framework or platform to build capacity, whereby seniors help families, help children. Children, in fact, also help step in and help seniors. So really, this sort of intentional, mission-driven idea for how they live together. And again, so this is a sort of East Hampton, sort of ex-urban site. And I think one of the opportunities for us when we kind of came on board is how do we bring this model to the city of Boston? How do we make it an urban model, looking to provide for more units with about 25% the site area? So we're looking at a site in Mattapan. And again, in some ways, this is an opportunity to think about how we can build for the moment to sort of meet the contemporary needs for density with housing. And so, looking back at the mission of what Treehouse is trying to do, we really want to sort of center this idea of interdependence, of connection, and density. And I think for us, that really kind of became manifested in this idea of a circle, this idea of gathering in place in a circle, establishing this idea of proximity, visibility, and sort of this shared goal and focus. So this kind of cartoon in some ways became kind of the generative idea for the building form. And so again, as you see this building take shape, 4 stories, courtyard as its heart, this idea of this spatial system of interdependence, really focusing eyes on the common, becoming the kind of framework for moving through the building. And then kind of cutting down a little bit here, one of the ways this works, obviously, is with this single loaded corridor. This idea that you always, through your moving through the building, have a view of the courtyard where community life happens. Also, the idea of creating this corridor in some ways prioritizes an idea of walking loops, empowering older adults to navigate their space, feel confident in their space. And also, again, this single loaded corridor connects to program of various scales, be it the large community room, the art classroom, informal meeting nooks, shared kitchens. So the idea that we wanted to provide choice and agency for residents to really cultivate community at the scale that works for them. And really kind of embracing this idea of shared living as we deal with, we're providing housing from studio units to 5 bedrooms. So within that, it puts a lot of pressure on the unit. So we wanted to actually really celebrate and give primacy to living outside the unit. And just sort of quickly, one other thing I want to emphasize here is this focus on this idea of healing. And we really wanted to bring to this process a focus on trauma-informed design, really understanding how we can meaningfully use the design process to center ideas of healing, right? So the courtyard also helps to establish clear wayfinding, clear sight lines. You know your space, you have agency over your surroundings. Even the sort of finishes, natural materials, warm color palette, flexibility with how people can kind of have agency to take over the space and move furniture around as they see fit. And again, this is just a rendering of the courtyard looking back. I think one thing that's worth noting here is you've got the centralized courtyard. We have a little meeting nook underneath as well as a terrace at level 3. Again, this idea of different scales of space to really kind of occupy and give the residents more agency. I see this thing flashing at me saying I'm over time. So one thing here, just looking at kind of the more urban condition, this program, this building is intentionally introverted. I think this idea of how to nurture and support a community really focused in on how we can create community spaces, outdoor spaces that are in some ways privatized for the residents and for this intentional community building model of, again, seniors, foster families, and youth transitioning out of the foster care system. At the same time, we did want to be intentional about embracing connections to the larger context. Again, this building exists as part of a multi-building new development, creating a welcoming front yard and open spaces in the front, as well as intergenerational recreational activities at the rear of the site as well. So really trying to play within this idea of being both introverted and extroverted. And yeah, again, so just we are excited about this opportunity to really bring to form how you sort of build in a community. And with that, I will pass it over.
Yeah, good. Care house. The context is the care crisis, as we heard. Not only the elder boom or silver tsunami, but also simply there are not going to be enough hands going around to take care of older adults. But then the other side of that is caregivers and the high job turnovers, precarity of housing, and difficulties that caregivers have. Add to that the housing crisis. We haven't really designed for aging. We heard about that as well. And further, the social determinants of health, which we realize more and more how isolation really disrupts or kind of damages aging. The three of us got together. We met at MIT. Marissa is an artist. She was working with the National Domestic Alliance. Ernst is a developer, real estate developer and urban planner, and he was doing senior housing. I was still looking at collective housing. So for personal reasons and professional, we got together and we formed Care House around the idea, can we expand a typology, or can we introduce a typology that expands the options that older adults have? We know there's independent living, assisted living, nursing homes, but can we create a model which is basically a mixed-use residential building that has independent units for older adults and caregivers and their families, and is organized around shared spaces? That's the kind of concept. How it works, it's a rental. Older adults move in when they are independent, ideally, so they can age in place. Caregivers can move in with their families. There's a multitude of unit types, from studios, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedrooms. And it's organized in a way that, as you'll soon see with the plans, that the units are kind of flanking the shared spaces. The first building is in Baltimore, on a corner site that we purchased. And the impacts and the whole community engagement is critical to this. First of all, as the process of identifying the site and beginning the process of co-design, the tenants are kind of gathered about ideally half a year to a year before the building is completed. The plans, can we see the plans? Yes. So it's a very simple U-shape. Every floor has a central, what is in pink, shared space, and it recedes in section. So every floor also has a balcony that then overlooks the other floor. So the actual spatial layout here is helpful on many levels. There are no corridors. The shared spaces are completely lit and open to the terraces, so there is outdoor space. Initially, it was developed during COVID, so this idea of outdoor space was critical. But then where is this? Okay. Then as you kind of go up in floors, each of these shared spaces is programmed differently. One would be a dining area, one would be a lounge, one would be a kind of a winter garden, etc. And you can see in the axon kind of how the units are organized around that. So in addition to all that, the art piece, art and I would say storytelling comes in, because every floor is designed with a different motif and different colors. And this is critical to many issues of aging, whether it's memory boxing, oh, what floor am I on, right? And obviously the design context works here against the over-institutionalized design we create for older adults. Which is all the same. It's all banal, it's all boring, it's all uninspiring. So from a design point of view here, as an overall architecture expression, the motivation was, let's have it, not look at all like an old people's home in a way. Let's have this work, but also engage large windows that look onto the street, right? And have it much more urban in a sense. And then the art comes also through the ground level, retail space, and this kind of mesh that gets lit at night and activates the street and so forth. I'll go briefly through the project that is actually now first set up, which is in Chicago, which is a slightly different approach because we understood that it's easier, let's say, to build these in areas of 20 to 25 units, but that's not enough. So we developed more of a network approach in Chicago, and the city of Chicago awarded us $5 million grant to build the first one. Here you see the plan, same, different site, but same principle, right? The kind of U-shaped courtyard, the setback terraces, and the mix of units. Here, there's another component that we're also working with an existing building that we're renovating, and that becomes part of that. So you see kind of the main shared space where, again, the units are completely independent, but the caring takes place within the shared areas. And it's really significant to have a certain amount of caregivers, because in many cases in Chicago and in Baltimore, caregivers are single parents, and they don't have to watch over their kids. So there are many kinds of social relationships that develop, and the architecture is really supporting that.
Okay, amazing. All right, hi everybody. Thank you so much for having us here today, and I'll jump right in. So I'll be talking a little bit about a project that we did in collaboration with the City of Boston's Housing Innovation Lab a number of years ago, called Co-Creating Boston's Future Decker. We began with a typological study of the triple decker, recognizing that it was built en masse between the late 1800s and the 1930s, and it was really fascinating because it was a building typology that was, one, built on small sites across the city. It was mass-produced due to its sort of having a replicable model. I will go back a little bit. And it's also, as a building typology, a fascinating one because it includes windows on all sides of the building. It has this outdoor access with the decks on each of the floors. It is the same replicated unit on all 3 levels as well. And it was a method for so many immigrant families to be able to call Boston home, not just for themselves, but over generations. And so the model was sort of, we talked about grandmothers earlier, folks moving into maybe one of the units, buying the entire building, moving into one of the units, and having family members live in the other floors as well. And sometimes even alternating if you had specific accessible needs, grandparent moving to the first floor so that they wouldn't have to go up all of the stairs. It's helpful to include this image because when we talk about the urban context, we also see this very replicated model sort of as this is an image from East Boston in the 1970s. You see clothing lines hanging. You can recognize that there are folks who can view onto other decks as well. So you could arguably have a conversation across those spaces. And so very helpful as an urban typology. In 2022, Mayor Wu conducted a citywide land audit, taking a look at which city-owned parcels existed and which ones could lend themselves to urban development. And so many of those were small sites, and that essentially meant that there were about, I think, 75% of them that were actually under 5,000 square feet. So we then asked folks to consider what the next iteration of this building typology could look like, inviting them to think through what we've been calling the future decker. So the future decker is this building typology that would be more than 3 units and somewhere between 6 to 15 to hopefully make some of the development numbers work. We conducted a 2-phased initiative over a number of years. The first phase really examining and looking into ideas. And from those ideas, we asked not just trained designers, but residents to imagine what the future decker could look like, pulling out these 5 key themes. And then in phase 2, folks were asked to submit proposals. And these are some of the images from the proposals for 2 city-owned parcels specifically. We recognized, I think one of our questions was, what is the role of the designer in all of this? And it is to be someone who can sort of, yes, design these. It can be a sort of homeowner or a resident who is really interested in piecing their own idea of what the future of housing could be. It is folks who have their lived experience. It's certainly the trained designers. It is municipal workers. It is nonprofits inviting these ideas and proposals to come about. And then certainly one of the things that we at the Boston Society for Architecture really call upon is how can you actually invite people to be not just trained designers, but also remember that they are residents in their own cities and towns as well. And so over the other projects that we've been looking at, we've been asking folks to leverage their expertise as designers, to invite them to participate and offer suggestions for what the future of housing can be in our region. And so these are some of the initiatives that we are looking into right now, including adaptive reuse. So excited about this conversation. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you. We can have the lights back on now, I think. Let me ask a question about all of you mentioned in some level or another the idea of spaces where people could come together. Some of them rather specifically planned. And what was the phrase? I've lost where I wrote it down, but accidental interactions. People just bump into each other. Tell me what the results have been from that design work. Has it happened? It's nice to put it on a piece of paper and say, that's what should happen there. Can you tell if it's happening yet?
I mean, I will jump in and say, yes, the residents of this particular co-housing community, which incidentally kind of became a community through the long process of coming together, getting their bank loan, designing a community, et cetera. But now the sort of accidental that become planned, picking up of someone else's children, teenagers, bringing in a friend to, convert a car to electric in the basement, gardening, a resident, making a cheese cave out of the pantry. All sorts of things are sort of organically happening. So I would say yes. Having been there demonstrably, I think these kind of spaces of negotiation and friction, and this came up on the earlier panel. Yeah. I think that this is exactly, in a way, and maybe what I was trying to hint at is if our sort of blood ties to one another and obligations are on some level not what they once were, how do we find other forms of social connection and social fabric that, and I know you have this experience as well, make us encounter each other organically?
That's very good news, Jenny, I must say. Jonathan, you look like you want to say something too.
Yeah, I think one of the things for the work with Treehouse is that we are building on the success of their current project, right? And I think what we're seeing there is because you have a very intentionally curated community that is very focused on making sure that it works and focused on making sure that the ideals are lived up to, that there's constant questioning of what can we do to be doing this better. We were able to sort of observe and sort of visit them and see and learn what works well, and what are the things that, as we think about recontextualizing that into a smaller, more urban context, what are the successes there that have to translate? What are the must-haves, just from a achieving impact standpoint? So, yeah, I think, and again, it's a little bit of what you kind of led with, because this is a sort of intentional community. I think there is inherently that like an obligation, the sort of calling for them to make sure it works.
It's interesting. I want to underline that sentiment, but this group came together with the idea that they were going to have this happen, that a community is going to grow out of our moving in together as a conscious piece of the starting place.
Yeah, and I think that was almost the intergenerational nature was a strategy to achieve to work towards the goal of how do we help foster kids, how do we help seniors age better? Let's put them together, right? And I think they've seen measurable impact in terms of success of foster kids, in terms of post-secondary graduation rates, things like that. Seniors living better longer. So I think it was more than just putting the bubbles together. It was just like, we're doing this for this reason.
That's great. That's great. Rafi, same story. You're accidental bumping into each other's spaces.
We don't know yet. It has to be built first.
Well, there would be that.
Right. I can say, housing is a very conservative thing in the sense it's really a habit. And when you introduce a new model, in architecture in general, but in housing specifically, it's really difficult. So our strategy is, and we're working with a lot of local partners wherever we work, to begin kind of the prep work, let's say, even 2 years in advance, a year in advance, to get people accustomed to the idea. And that's key as a way to kind of begin to consider that there are other ways of living.
Another really, really important point. I think we can't overstress the extent to which we have been raised as a culture to want our own private space. And this idea that we would benefit from, not just we could tolerate, but we would benefit from being in community with other people is a bit of a stretch for many of us. So I'm glad you made that point, Rafi. I think that's exactly right. Tell me about, yours aren't built yet either, are they? Or
No.
are some of them built? Yep.
Yeah, so we did not end up awarding a team the sites through that initiative, but I think what I can speak to was during our typological research, we hosted a number of sort of conversations with folks who were living in triple deckers, and this was in 2020, so truly the height of the pandemic, and it was fascinating to see how even with the sort of distancing measures that we needed to consider, how folks were still coming together during that time. And I remember people mentioning that they were repurposing their decks to either be sort of gardens that they would tend to, or using the staircases as those moments, like opportune moments to actually interact with their neighbors and spend time there as well. So I think that there was a lot of adaptation that came out of conversations with folks with existing triple deckers.
All of you mentioned the idea of, well, not Wandy's project, but all of the other three of you mentioned the idea, well, your research did this, Wandy, of people talking about this before they had a building. What did they talk about the most? What were they most concerned about for you designers? How did they tell you, we got to have this, or please, whatever you do, don't do that?
There was a whole discussion where the laundry would be, for example, So we ended up doing laundry per floor, so you don't have to go down or up. And then, is it side by side or one on top of the other? Because for older adults, it's about bending, right? So you want to kind of, is it top load or front load, right? So, I mean, that's an example. That's a very practical thing. But obviously there were a lot of other issues, just to give you.
Yeah. I mean, we also, the kind of wish list that then has to foment into a budget and amassing, et cetera. But right. Laundry, there's laundry on every level, but then a common laundry room. One other, I think, really foundational principle of this group that we worked with is that they wanted no private outdoor space. So always speaking to your better angels of I'm not going to retreat to my own deck. So there are like decks all over the place in the courtyard. But the idea is that you're always sort of entering into this shared space.
The public
exactly.
Space.
Yeah, I think for Treehouse, one of the things that was interesting is that they have, East Hampton works well, and I think there's a concern that there's this alchemy that just everything works well. How do we translate that to Boston? And this idea of now this is a building that's part of a larger development. How do we protect and create this, again, the courtyard, this sort of very insular, introverted nature, but also, again, the opportunity to connect to a broader neighborhood. So I think that that was something that was very much, and still is kind of debated. Like, how do we make sure that it's going to work because it worked that well in East Hampton, and how do we try to translate that and get the benefit of being in a more urban context?
Maybe I might just jump in. I mean, also the Core 4 architecture students are here who are all charged with these infill sites and thinking about easements and boundary conditions. And I think the lessons learned are also that these are living places and that access, this idea of sort of community and propriety, which are something we've been talking about in our studio, that have to be in a kind of balance, right? How do you produce a sense of security and safety within the complex, but also, how does that evolve over time?
One of the three-deckers are hard for this kind of issue. How do people think about how you ought to modify that three-decker into a future decker?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of the sort of access to outdoor space, you had to get very creative, and so some folks were thinking about how to elevate some of those outdoor spaces. I think that the access to light as a way to honor the triple decker was a very fascinating one, because you knew that you wouldn't be able to have the sort of entire footprint of the level. And so how can you still offer as much light, for example, in a single unit that you know wouldn't take up that entire footprint as well. So there were a couple of creative solutions that I think that some of the teams really lended themselves to. And I would say that also the mode of construction, lots of folks were also invited to use new methods of construction. So many of those were folks who were looking into modular construction, offsite construction as well, and the flexibility and sort of being able to work with those offsite and then think about installation processes, which I think would get to this is a living place. And so how do you time that accordingly?
Let me ask a question of you designers, because you four are not like I experience some designers. That is to say, many designers essentially check out at the ribbon cutting, right? I've designed it, it's now built, it's all set to go, I'm on my next project. I suspect because of the nature of the projects you've been designing, that you are also thinking about the longer term. If this group that's come together, suddenly their roof wears out in 3 years, or their windows turn out to be no good at all and they have to be replaced, we put a big problem in the midst of this intergenerational community that they're going to have to solve. How do you work on these projects so that you have made it easier for them to not have to struggle with those issues and instead work on community? Rafi, yeah.
Tough one, so I'm gonna take it. Now, first, really important to clarify something, as we're talking to the students and designers here as well.
Yes.
Design alone will not make a successful shared space. It will enable it, but we need other mechanisms, protocols in place in order for this to work. That's one thing. The other thing I learned is, and it kind of changed the way I was working on this project, I'm not just designer, I'm part of the development team. So I take risk, I take responsibility, and together with my partners, and we're there for the longer game, right? It's a model that we envision to be replicated, and so it's not, we're in the neighborhood with local partners way in advance, and we plan to stay. And so we're establishing connections. So it's a completely different approach than just architecture services in a way.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I'll take that. I think to your question of what design can do, I think the aspiration of what we try to put out there, I think in some ways it's very much hand in hand with what we know our partner can support and do. And so, to Ravi's point, the success of this building also lies on the fact that you have a developer or a management team that is there to nurture and make sure that they can cultivate and steward this project to allow community to happen, so that if there's a broken window, it's taken care of. And I think relative to the role of us as architects, I think, this is an aspirational model that is advocating for building differently. I think the idea of providing more social space that we're seeing in all these projects has a cost. And I think what we're trying to do here is we're making a bet that we think that's needed and that's necessary to provide the kind of impact we want with the projects. And I think what we want to do also after the design is done, after the ribbon cutting, is actually find a way to measure that. So that way we can then, for the next project, advocate for that. So it becomes part of the kind of systems change we want to see in how we build.
Great.
Yeah,
Bonnie, go ahead.
I agree. I was going to talk a lot about how there's something that continuously comes up in conversations with our architect members, which is that we do not have mechanisms for doing post-occupancy analyses. And so the fact that all of you are considering that or building that into your processes is a feat and not a small one. And so I think as our type of organization, it really is sort of trying to find mechanisms and financial opportunities for folks to actually be able to have post-occupancy analyses, because a lot of the times, and your question was about how do you make sure that you don't come back to that exact building and do as much as possible there. And to Jonathan's point, you have to be able to measure those successes. You have to be able to recall that data so that it informs the next building and the next building and the next building, because we can't solve the housing crisis at one sole building, and we recognize that it's not just a municipal issue, but it's also a regional issue.
Great, Jen.
Yeah, I think that the kind of two aspects of uncommon housing types, but also uncommon development models, is thinking about taking on of risk, but also I really appreciate this comment about the contemporary boarding house and ways in which we have to understand protocols as something that we're not just, we'll worry about later. So maybe on the sort of ideological standpoint, I'd strongly believe that the sort of, the statement that, conflict is not a bug of democracy, but a feature, we all have to embody, right? And that actually embodying the ways that we negotiate, right, and have something that we care enough to dispute about or to have a difference of opinion is actually foundational.
Good.
And so that in the case of, self-developing a project, there is no them. I mean, to some degree, yes, the professionals are the them, but in a way, the designer's role as a kind of fiduciary operating on behalf of the client is essential. So if there's no them and you're the them, then you have to do the special assessment, right? Or in the case of this group, 2 years in, they got their solar panels, which they couldn't afford at the, first occupancy.
Suddenly them is we.
Exactly. Yes.
So, folks, what questions do you have for our panel of designers? Right in front. David.
And if we could ask folks to identify themselves.
Sure. I'm Paige Rusa, Director of the Housing Innovation Lab for the City of Boston. Thank you all for another awesome conversation. Rafi, I have been following the Care House for years now and waiting for when we can celebrate the groundbreaking. Why isn't this coming to life?
We could have built a few already, but not for low income. And we wanted it for low income, so now the City of Chicago gave us this grant, and we can go ahead and build one for low income.
That's awesome. Can I ask one follow-up, which is, so the program makes a lot of intuitive sense, but from a practical standpoint, if the caregiver no longer is a caregiver, do they have to move out?
Not necessarily. The caregivers are organized by a care provider, meaning is in the same way you have a building manager, you will have a kind of care manager. And there are various scenarios we're working through, and we have, like a 20-page FAQ I can share, but not necessarily.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, what is that? James, and then over here.
Hi, Kim Vermeer, local consultant. Can you just describe which of these are ownership models and which are rental models, and this question of affordability, how that's factoring in both to the making the projects real and the design decisions in the creating of the concepts in the projects?
I'll kick off and say this is it's just a condo model, so it's ownership. I kind of joke that co-housing is like a condo commune. There's some shared and intentionality behind it, but its financial structure is really that it is a condominium association of owners, which is not to say that understanding hybrid tenure and rental plus ownership is not of great interest, but yes. They created their own construction loan that then was turned into individual mortgages.
And speaking for Treehouse, it is the Treehouse Mattapan product is rental, financed through conventional kind of light tech tax credits.
Yeah, a care house is rental.
For the Future Decker, it would have been an ownership model for middle income individuals and families between 80 to 120% of AMI.
And I'll just give you one little last thing, Kim. I live in a cooperative, which is a slightly different organizational principle than either condominiums or rentals. So there are 3 full-scale models. Question here.
Yes, Will Fleissig, Collaborative Equities, and I'm also a lecturer here at the real estate program with Tim Love. Jonathan, really interested in your Malden project. Can you give us a little more insight about the sponsor, the developer, your role, the structure, how it came together, and then in order to get the LIHTC, I mean, you need people who really know how to pull deals together, the construction loan. Just give us a little more insight about how that team came together to produce this product. Thank you.
For the Mattapan project? The Malden project.
Oh. That was me. Yes, me? Oh. Sorry. No. So there was no LIHTC funding. This is literally a group that came together, sort of primarily millennials and boomers. They created a social membership and then equity membership. They pooled their funds together to get a construction loan. Some of those who, for example, had more equity in their homes were able to contribute more, and sort of then those who had to sort of skate the edge of moving out of their house, moving into a rental, or selling their current house, or getting their financing together, were able to sort of be bridged by those other equity members. But they did hire a consultant whose name was Chris Scott Hansen, who is now sadly deceased during the process, who had helped a number of groups across the country develop it and basically speak to banks to get the financing together. And then really the kind of the most difficult and dramatic moment was just as construction was completing and they're hoping to take occupancy. Mortgage rates were suddenly increasing such that it seemed as though the financing of the project was also in question. So I think that, and there have been many examples of co-housing communities that have not been able to get over that hurdle, including one in Connecticut that Kelly Crossley kind of ran a story on not too long ago that went bankrupt, midway through construction, which is incredibly sad. And also, an undue burden of risk, unfortunately, is that, these things are hard to replicate. So.
Jonathan, can you talk about your project as well? How the team came together, financed the Herbert project?
Sure, I'll do it as quickly as I can. So the Treehouse project is part of a 10-building, 200-plus unit development in Mattapan at the site of the old Boston State Hospital. Again, there's been a long effort to rebuild the area, and Treehouse as a consortium, it works with another nonprofit developer and another developer partner to just have a comprehensive vision for the parcel. I feel like I can talk about this for half an hour, but maybe I can talk about it at the reception. I think we've been at it for a while. I think we've been trying to, again, design the building to kind of hit the sweet spot and thread the needle in terms of what makes sense from amplifying Treehouse's model, but also working with the confines of the QAP and LIHTC funding. I feel like I've got follow-up questions to ask more specific, so I might want to.
Yeah, Tim.
Here you go.
I only raised my hand to help Will focus the question to you. As you know, at the firm I'm part of, Util, a vast majority of our practice is market rate and LIHTC financed multifamily housing, and so I have a built-in net to gross meter whenever I see plans of projects, and I'm interested because I suspect that the percentage of amenities to units and the amount of shared circulation to rentable space is off the charts, and for the guidelines that we have to follow for our conventional affordable housing projects, this would get sent to the end of the line for not being good cost value for delivery of housing. Does this project fall in a different category of evaluation for LIHTC financing, or is the gap filled by philanthropic funding, which tends to always loosen up the net to gross a little bit? I'm just wondering how how you're able to do architecture like that when we're never allowed to.
Well, I think that's helpful framing. I think a few layers there. I think one, philanthropy is a player in this a little bit. I think being able to show that this is not just conventional housing, that there is a model that has shown proof of impact that we're able to advocate for in terms of delivering the results. But yeah, we have 5-bedroom units, which actually they don't have criteria for that in the QAP. So how do you design a 5-bedroom unit and fit in within this structure is very difficult. So I think. Short answer is we don't have any secret kind of group of products within LIHTC. I mean, it is the standard multifamily housing project in there, and I think it's really understanding how we can amplify the mission, how we can use that to sort of tell the story of impact, and have philanthropy help support it as well. And also, again, we're getting support from the City of Boston as well. So there's just other people that have understood this as a model that is needed and are willing to advocate and back it up.
Let me just underline what Jonathan just said, if I may, Tim. It's a great question. The housing world is not restricted to residents, architects, and developers. The bankers, the insurance agencies all play a big role in what we can and can't do. And for all of you who come here today, you've come here because you're interested in a new form of housing, which is not traditional. And I want to encourage you to insist that that's okay. And that we should be able to we shouldn't have to conform to what everybody else thinks our housing should be like. Those of you who are advocates should use those voices to say, no, you have to adjust your program so we can build this kind of housing, which makes a lot of sense for a lot of people.
Yeah, and thank you. And I guess the one thing I would say is that, again, we're deep in construction documents. We had to go through the rounds of VE and talking with the contractors, and we actually had to test out, okay, if we did this as a conventional double-loaded corridor, what would the loss be in terms of impact, in terms of how the building would work, and actually what is the delta in terms of cost. And again, I think we all did that with an open mind, and we realized that this was the best way to go. So we weren't naive to the market in terms of how we developed this proposal. I think it was very much tested, and people tried to chip away at it, but I think we were able to, again, preserve the core diagram.
Each one of these things that happens becomes a comp for the next one that somebody wants to do. And so we got to insist on doing these things so that it's easier for the people to do the next one.
Amen.
I've got a couple more questions. Lynn? Almost out of time. Lynn? No.
Run, Dave. Hi, I'm Lynn I'm Lynn Grasso. I'm a fair housing practitioner and until recently with HUD. I've been following the triple decker and following Boston's interest in it. And I'm curious why you speak about the initiative in past tense and what happened that kind of didn't bring it to full fruition.
Yeah. That is a great question. So after we received the proposals, we realized that there was a significantly high cost across the proposals for what would be possible to do. And many of them also included higher sort of value for government subsidy that would have been necessary for the project. And so unfortunately, we did have to make the very incredibly difficult decision to refuse the proposals and then to really strategize and come together to think about what the future iteration of that could look like, even if it's not developing the future Decker as we saw it in the proposals. And I think that I will give credit to the folks at the city. I know that there's so many of them here today in taking the learnings and the findings of the Future Decker initiative to transform them into other initiatives. I'll make a plug for the city's co-purchasing program that was sort of turned to the existing building types that we have currently available and finding mechanisms for middle income folks to actually be able to collectively purchase a triple decker or other building types of sorts. So it continues on, not to mention the sort of zoning initiatives that happen across the city. It's been fascinating to see the proposal for 6 units as of right, and so thinking through those other mechanisms, and then also city councilors trying to bring that conversation to the forefront and talking about how we should be able to zone those as of right. So a couple of different continuations, and I think that the future Decker lives on.
In the back.
Hi, my name is Kyle Barker. I have an architecture firm called Primary Projects, and I'm teaching Core 4 right now at the GSD. This kind of builds on Jim's imploring us all to imagine different futures. And I think one thing that struck me in looking at the projects is many of them are probably pushing against what's possible by building code. And so I was curious if there were aspects of building code or maybe zoning even that pushed against things you wanted to do and how you overcame those challenges.
Rafi says so many. So you get to go first, Rafi.
I can give a small example of the kitchen. It's not an assembly, it's a shared space. So we can't have a conventional kitchen in there. As a shared kitchen, it has to be, sink, fridge, and microwave, but we can't cook. So the way we operate is we partner with different organizations that come in, and whether it's an artist through a museum that comes and does, a class once every 2 weeks, or whether it's a restaurant that would come in with pre-prepared food. So we had to change the way we provide these amenities to the residents because of certain zoning and building code restrictions.
That's the other guys I forgot to mention. Lenders, insurance companies, code guys. Jenny?
I know. Maybe one other thing to plug is, as Wandy's bringing up, that the City Council in Boston is also discussing the elimination of parking requirements, for future residential developments. So one thing that in the project was not on the table for the new zoning ordinance was a reduction in the parking requirement, which was 1 car per bedroom, which is actually extremely high. So it has a full underground garage for 50 parking spaces. So in a way, thinking about where just the development cost in parking is a very obvious place to go.
We didn't have a parking issue because of older adults, but the city of Chicago wanted bikes. And we said, wait, hold on. It's maybe, how many bikes do you want for each unit? A bike, it's not that reasonable. So it's ongoing conversations, but yeah.
What else? Here's the question over here.
Hi, thank you. Samuel Orlando, human experience researcher at Perkins & Will and future GSD student. I have a question about all of your projects included some type of courtyard or nod to voyeurism in a certain way. I think about, you could take that however you want. But I think about Jane Jacobs and her phrase, eyes on the street, and you alluded to it, Professor French, earlier about public and private space with the landscaping. But I was curious to know, in your micro-urbanism projects, I would consider, what were the conversations around community safety like?
Safety?
Happy to start. Yeah. I would say that safety came up a lot, especially once we made it to the second phase of our initiative, and particularly with the residents who were neighbors to that particular site, and that it is really, I think, what we noticed was that in the community meetings that we were hosting, there were lots of folks actually asking for other sort of city services that they were requiring, and that was the moment and opportunity that they also found to sort of lift those things up. I think that to everyone who is not a designer, it truly is not enough to say, well, we'll have windows and you can have a deck and you can look onto, and we'll collectively do that. It's just not I think, a way that really resonates with too many people, but we recognize that creating those can lend itself to that. But I think that whenever we have the conversations around safety, it has to be backed up by, which I think is something you said earlier, what else, like, can you fix the lights on that street? And can whoever develops on this parcel tend to those things in addition to whatever they'd be building on there?
Yeah, I guess I'd say for the work with Treehouse, there was just always a fundamental desire to connect to nature and understanding that as part of a healing process. And so what we wanted to do is to leverage as many opportunities as we can to make that happen, both as the sort of figurative central point of the project, but also again, empowering residents with choice, where they could look at that, they could be in that, they could go to the other deck on the other side of the building. They can have the ability to engage with the community at their comfort level and have the, again, the agency to feel empowered to make that decision about what feels right to them in terms of how they want to use nature. So I think it was important for that to not just be a sort of singular gesture, but actually be taken deeper to understand how to make that space, make more of those spaces, and also connect to the Audubon and other nearby natural features of the site.
Yeah, I might just actually build on that and think about how social comfort, and in Boston, in the greater Boston area, thermal comfort, right? We all assume we can never go outside because it's cold, but in fact, right, having some connection to the outdoors as another way of producing shared space, I think is pretty foundational, so that the kind of shared courtyard form, there's a reason why the sort of repetition of that, as well as kind of deck access, which is embodied in the triple decker in a more disaggregated way as well. But that perhaps one thing about eyes that I already brought up the sort of term of community and propriety, which is coming from this 1973 MoMA low-rise high-density show that resulted in the Marcus Garvey apartments, somewhat failed at its scale, and et cetera. But that thinking about how collectivity is then maintained through a sense of ownership, and even if that ownership is something that you project onto your balcony, your front door, right? And so that this sort of sense, that horizontal space that actually allows for the residents to feel like they are kind of claiming or producing an invisible boundary, I think is there. And we haven't had Jim talk about his own experience as the sort of longest uncommon liver, but I think, might you add a note on this?
We're behind time, so I'll say just 2 seconds worth of words. I've lived in a cooperative apartment building up on the other end of Oxford Street. A bunch of friends and ourselves bought an apartment building. We bought an apartment building and we paid, in 1973, we paid $120,000 for a 12-unit apartment building. The 11 people that live there today have lived there. Of the 11 people who live there today, 8 of us have lived there all 53 years. So the idea of building a community and making that a community that has been supportive as we have aged over the years. We've been through pretty much every stage of adult life together. And it is one of the ways I thought about earlier about this business of letting people think about the idea of shared living, which is all of our children have understood that now. Some of them live in other shared houses on their own generation. Others don't, but they really are open to it and talk about it, and it doesn't seem so strange to them. And so one of our strategies is probably to get some of you guys to make a choice like this and make that the norm. When people ask us, so was that better than living in a single-family house in Arlington? To which the answer is, well, I have no idea. I've never lived in a single-family house in Arlington. So yes, we've had quite a wonderful. You can imagine, we had our meetings at Commonplace, not during COVID, not all on Zoom. We would open our doors from our apartments and meet across the central hallway. I have lots of stories. I'll be happy to be around at the reception. We got to go because the next panel. I hope you've convinced that designers can make a big difference in how communities can come together like this at our Intergenerational. So please thank these folks for us.
This is the third and final panel of the afternoon. My name's Tim Love. I teach in the planning and real estate programs here, and I'm the founding principal of UTIL, and we do, we're housing architects. We do a lot of planning, and more I'm involved with policy work. So that's where we thought we would kind of land it today, which is to, as Jen mentioned at the very beginning of the symposium, each panel deals with a different scale. We started with the household. Intentional communities was the last discussion about ground up intentional communities. And when we discussed as the group that was organizing the symposium how to think about neighborhoods and cities, policy was really the answer, because we don't, as designers, design neighborhoods and cities directly. And then thinking about it, and being a fan of and aware of the evolving priorities of the city of Boston, I thought it would be interesting to get people playing different roles of the city of Boston who are intersecting in some ways with this theme of intergenerational communities, and get you maybe to think a little bit differently about what you do through that theme, or maybe not. So that's the setup here. And we're all friends here, and I'm interested to see what you have to say. So I think first, I think it would be easiest if, and Paige, you're from the city too. Anyone else from the city of Boston here? Okay, awesome. So I think first I'll have each of the panelists introduce themselves and just contextualize their role at the city relative to this theme. So.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Burns. I'm with the city's Age Strong Commission, and I direct the Age and Dementia Friendly Initiative for the city. I'm with my two colleagues, Corinne Brindley and David Reedy in Brown, third table, wonderful team. And I have been the director since 2015. And if everyone is familiar with this concept of age-friendly cities, this concept is very much front and center to that framework. And as part of the work in our commission, we have done everything from mapping public restrooms to a bench program to mapping age-friendly walks to an intergenerational home share program with Noel Marcus and Nesterly, to work with Paige Russa of the iLab, and really trying to move our city and development more toward universal design for the 90% of the rest of the population of Boston that is not, the 10% ADU handicapped accessible units. So I think that's really our role, is really to be advocates, to listen to residents, to listen to older adults, and then to advocate for the types of things that we're hearing from them, and trying to work with our city partners, our other city departments, to sort of enact those things that we've heard in the community.
Great. And are you a standalone department, or are you under the umbrella of, we're not going to get into org charts here, but I'm just curious.
Well, yes, we are in the Health and Human Services Cabinet, but we are in the Age Strong Commission, and the Age Friendly Initiative is part of the Age Strong Commission.
Okay, great. Will?
Am I audible? Yes, okay. So my name is Will Cohen. I am an urban planner at the City of Boston Planning Department. There's actually a wing of the City of Boston Planning Department, formerly known as the BRA, formerly known as the BPDA, called the Zoning Reform Team. And so there's actually a whole flock of planners up there working on updating the zoning code to better align with what we need today. And so I'm one of them. I'm a GSD graduate, MUP 13. I did not see myself living here in 2026, but here I am. I, for the last couple of years, have been primarily working with the zoning reform team on updating the residential zoning code to enable ADUs by right across the city of Boston. In some sense, that's actually changed, and now we're expanding it more broadly to be about residential housing writ large. It doesn't formally take intergenerational housing as the primary goal, but I would say all the aspects of what we've heard about this entire afternoon are part and parcel of what it means to update zoning.
Great. Trish?
Hi, everyone. My name is Trish Cafferkey. I'm the Deputy Chief of Operations for the City of Boston. So the Operations Cabinet has 3 departments, not to get into org chart, but one of those is inspectional services, so we do all the permitting for the city. The second is property management, so all of our facility maintenance. And then the third is public facilities, so all of our major capital projects. And my role also handles all of our major City of Boston real estate decisions.
Great. And last but not least, the most, or?
I think I might have, oh, I did turn it on. I'm Kristen McSwain. I'm the Chief of Policy and Research for the City of Boston. I sit in the mayor's office. And as it pertains to this conversation, I think one of the things that we really think about is how is the public realm in Boston a place where people will be able to experience healthy connections and relationships, both in family units, but also among different family units. So how are we thinking about places and spaces as places that foster healthy connections?
Great. I think I sent the panelists a kind of framing statement, and I'm going to paraphrase it here because it might help frame the conversation, because at one level you all do very different things. But certainly I know that some of the work that you do does intersect specifically around specific projects or alignment on even messaging from the city in terms of what the administration's priorities might be at a certain time. And so here we go. So I think for those that know me, I'm very interested in how policy decisions way upstream in a way affect the design of the city. Whether it's the building code, we talked about that in the last panel discussion. The building code secretly makes housing architects design buildings in a specific way. I think for the purpose of this conversation, my perception about city government is that by necessity, policy issues have to be tackled in specific buckets. And those buckets might be different kinds of policy tools like land use planning or decisions about capital projects or programs that have a budget implication. And often policy decisions are also packaged in demographic categories. For example, some policies might be focused on different levels of income or questions of ethnicity and race relative to programs the city might do. And age cohorts are another one. You know, age cohorts, whether it's schools and school-age children or seniors, or concerns about retaining people who are graduating from Boston's universities to stay in the city. A lot of policy is really specifically kind of sliced and diced that way. And I think maybe this framing as a way to get the conversation going maybe pertains most to what you do, Andrea, which is, you know, your focus is on aging and seniors. And I was wondering, as you think about the things that you discussed, whether it's improvements to the public realm or accessibility or programs that might more directly benefit seniors, how much is the relationship between seniors and other generations part of the discussion or a consideration in the work that you do?
We would like it to be much more than it currently is. And I truly believe that all of us are going to be asked to be making many more connections. And I think that we have been doing that in the city. I'm thinking of Geneva, the Geneva Ave Senior Community Center. That's going to be a shared community center, senior and youth center, very intentionally. I think we are already starting to do that work in the city, and I think we're going to need to do it a lot more. With diminishing funds, with tightening budgets, I think, and I'm not an expert on the funding at all, but what I do know is that there's a lot less funding, and in terms of housing specifically, older adult housing, senior housing has been a specific, I think it's section maybe 202, chapter 202 housing, and I don't know how the funding is, but I know that that has become less, that has been less and less of it. And so I think that I think as a city, and probably everyone and all municipalities are really going to have to embrace this idea that let's see, how can we do the most with shared spaces, shared housing, shared community centers. I was we have two senior centers that we run, that the city runs, and I was at our Brighton Senior Center. And our director there, we have a fabulous director, she was staying late. And I said, oh, why are you staying late? And she said, oh, because I have a grade school coming in to use the auditorium to, I think they were rehearsing a play. And I thought that is exactly right. Using our city buildings in very creative ways so that multi-generations can use them. And really getting away from this senior only, and I'm speaking for my own personal opinion in my work, getting away from this senior only housing, maybe more like the treehouse model, where it's a building is a standalone, but then it is among other generations. I truly believe that that is much more humane and accessible and the future.
But I like the idea that in a way, budget constraints are partly the catalyst for rethinking the relationship between generations in city buildings. I mean, my firm has done a whole series of branch libraries over the last 15 years or so, and the programming for those, which is are joint managed by the city and the Boston Public Library, are very intentional about making spaces for teens and younger children and their parents, and seniors are always a consideration. And in the library program, there's a tendency to think about the needs to slightly separate those populations, because teens don't like adults around, and teens scare certain age cohorts, and that was always a discussion of a lot of the work that we did. And I think the library, the branch library campaign that has been quite robust in the city has given the city a perspective on that, at least from a programmatic standpoint. So Trish, you've been involved with that, and I've been involved with it over the last couple of years, and we're also involved with the Grove Hall Community Center with you. What's your perspective on this? Because Andrea's framing about this could be cost effective too might even suggest that maybe new building program models might emerge that maybe even center intergenerational housing issues.
Yeah, I think Andrea's right. And I think we, especially right now, we have to do more with less. And that means no specific population can get their own building. Every building has to do multiple things. So, I'm an architect too. I think very spatially, but I think in this sense, we have to be thinking temporally, and we have to be thinking about spaces that can transition from being a senior center use during the day to teen use in the evening. And that does mean thinking about often like really affordable retrofits or things like that. But I don't think what you're going to see us do is build a brand new standalone senior center without thinking about who else would use that space and how it would serve many, many different populations.
But beyond the cost effectiveness of that, does that mean then that different age cohorts could occupy the building at the same time, or think that it's more of a scheduling issue?
I think that it's actually to everyone's benefit to have the cohorts occupy at the same time, but I do think that we recognize that a lot of kids are in school during the day, and adults, like older adults, come into community centers earlier in the morning and then leave earlier. We just know that there are different patterns of life, but I have seen programs at BCYF centers where it's pairing seniors with kids to do projects. And I think you would never want only teens in a library space. We put the teen space in the middle for a reason. You want eyes on the teen area. And so you want those different age groups are seeing each other and interacting all the time. So it's spatial, it's programmatic, it's temporal.
But beyond the program itself, the city facilities in a way foster the intergenerational neighborhoods around it. Because if there's a facility that serves all those populations, it's more likely that families and seniors and young professionals will live in that neighborhood because that's an amenity that might drive certain decisions about the neighborhoods that people live in. Because the libraries are strategically located, distributed through the city, decisions are made about community centers and the senior centers. How do those locational decisions, do the demographics of the communities drive the programmatic decisions, or is the idea that the city facilities might scramble a little bit the demographics that exist there today?
I think that we're currently working on a citywide needs assessment that the planning department is running, and I think that we are trying to be more intentional about using data to back up where we are doing what kinds of capital projects going forward. But I do think that in a large sense, we are responsive to demographic needs that exist today. We are trying to use population projections based on the zoning that, William's team is working on and others at the city are working on, but we also have to be responsive to, the population of kids in this neighborhood is decreasing and we're seeing seniors increase here. I do not personally believe that putting a different facility in that neighborhood is going to change that trend. In fact, I think that the trend is an indication that there are things in the private sector that I'm not able to affect. So we should be responsive to those trends.
There was the library noticed when the Alston Branch Library, the Honan Library was built that I was involved with, that as an amenity, it drew Harvard students to the neighborhood because of that amenity that didn't think to live there before, because the library was surprised how many students were actually in there studying when the original conception for the library and the users were very different. So, sometimes I think the very nice public libraries the city delivers, becomes an amenity still. I don't know. I think, Kristen, you look like you have something to say.
Yeah, I had a couple things to say. So, I think that Trisha's right. We don't control the private space, except that in some ways we do, right? So we're having this conversation about whether or not Boston is going to be a city that is 800,000 people. And if you look at our demographic trends, if you look at our immigration trends, particularly at this moment in time, you're right, we won't get to be a city of 800,000. Except if we build 800,000 units of housing, or housing that will fit that many people, and we do it the way we're doing it right now, people will come and they will look like me. And I mean that in every way. They will be as old as I am or older. They will probably be white. They will probably be at least middle income, if not upper, because of the kind of housing that we are currently permitting and building, right? And so if we want to have a city that doesn't look like that, then we need to be intentionally thinking about the different kinds of housing, specific to the stuff that I saw when we came in here earlier, but also maybe other things, right, that attract and in a mindful way think about the kind of city we want to create. That also leads to the things that we build in the public realm. If we're building libraries that families want to use, or that, brings in intergenerational programming, that will be a place that attracts a different kind of people than if we build 20-foot luxury condos in Back Bay. So, there is something that we control through the permitting, development, and other policy-making levers that we have. Some of them are blunter than others, but there's an opportunity for us to be thinking about that, and that's what we're trying to do through our citywide needs assessment. What are the kinds of things that we need to be mindful of as we're doing our work and thinking about how we become, I think we started with 880, we're now to 1 in 100. There was some different catchy phrase that I can't remember, that we're really being mindful and thinking about what is it we need in neighborhoods that will have people want to live in these places.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction. The city can provide city services that maybe have a soft social engineering intent, maybe. I don't want, that's not a good word to use probably, but then zoning is the thing that inspires private investment in the market to maybe make decisions that is the second half of what you were talking about, which is in Boston neighborhoods where single-family houses are predominant, you know, Hyde Park or West Roxbury, that was a development decision based on Euclidean zoning models that made those neighborhoods, because of the housing stock that's there at the time, relatively homogeneous. And so they were attainable single-family houses for families. But now probably, I don't know the facts, a lot of the people that live there are aging in place. There's probably a decline, I think, in the number of children. And so the question is, if zoning is introduced that changes the housing stock that's available in those neighborhoods, what's the intent of that? What's it trying to address? And how does it encourage maybe more, in this case, we're talking about age cohort diversity. How can zoning itself, it's like 3 steps away, change the demographics in a neighborhood? And I don't know, Will, that's maybe did you have something to say about that?
I mean, if I successfully answer that, I'll get the Nobel Prize. So I won't live up to all of it, but I can give some insight into the things that Tim was alluding to. So one also lovely thing about being part of a city government where it's part of a larger network of research institutions like the one we're sitting in today is that we have an excellent team of researchers that figure out a lot of these trends for us. So we're not exclusively groping in darkness. There's a report last year that the planning department did. I was not part of it. I just sit next to those people. And they found that approximately 20% of households in the city of Boston have children under the age of 18 in them. That's down 1% from about a decade earlier. But the number of children is also notable, right? So there's something like 240,000 households that have 0 children, right? So there's the bigger number of like 800,000, that's people. We're going down, and now let's talk about households, right? So there's 240-something thousand households that have 0 children under the age of 18. There are 30,000 households that have 1 child. There are 19,000 households that have 2 children. And there are 8,000 households that have 3 children, and that 8 was 10 a decade ago. So it went down the most. The other ones held fairly steady. And as a now aging millennial with a 3-year-old and 5-year-old, soon to be 6-year-old, that resonates. The cost of living is very high, as we all know in this room for sure. You know, just as a quick round number, the median house, single-family house selling in the city of Boston is about $1 million, or it hit that about a year ago. So, you know, were we to have a 3rd child in our household, we would be like one of these lucky few that find a way to stay in the city. But that childcare cost, housing cost, it's a challenge, right? And so I am a zoning reform planner. If the hammer of zoning makes everything look like a nail or whatever it is, like there's a lot of nails, right? And so why am I saying all this? It's because a lot of the work that we're doing touches on precisely these issues, right? So let me give you another couple set of stats. Actually, before that, we were a couple years ago. The mayor asked made a very reasonable ask of the planning department writ large, which eventually made its way to a team of people, including me, which was to, by the end of a couple years ago, ideally, fully legalize ADUs in the city of Boston. ADUs, I think you're all very familiar with it. We've heard a lot about them. The accessory dwelling unit, the idea that you would have another unit on your property, and in many cases, the idea of the accessory dwelling unit is sort of a cool, tiny house in your backyard. That's the vision, right? There's even a statewide law in Massachusetts to allow these things detached in people's backyards in East Bridgewater or whatever. And so that's now law of the land in the state of Massachusetts. And we tried really hard to just do something similar to what was happening in the rest of the state. And we didn't get there with our original deadline. And one of the reasons is that 90% of the people applying for ADUs in some form in the city of Boston are applying for what are called attached or internal ADUs. That is to say, things that are not separate buildings, but they're part of your main building. Maybe nothing changes on the outside of your building. You're just repurposing all the stuff on the inside to fit another unit. Maybe you're adding a little bit, maybe not not the whole unit is new construction. Maybe just a new room is new construction, but that allows you to fit 2 units where there were previously 1, or 3 units where there were 2, or so on and so on and so on. And that means you're touching the main building, which means what you're touching is zoning. And so that means that to do that thing, not the ADU registered trademark symbol, but like the addition of units to housing stock means that I'm really doing a lot of metaphors, but the Schrodinger's cat, Pandora's box, Boston's zoning thing, you got to open it up a little bit. And that is more than a 6-month process. So here we are with additionally gray hair. And so as we started working on these kinds of things, we had to go a little bit deep. And Bostonians have a lot of comfort around their zoning regulations and rules, and they have a lot of knowledge of them. There were over many decades, a lot of intensive neighborhood-specific processes yielding what is now a 4,000-page zoning code that's actually longer than New York City zoning code. We are special snowflakes here at the City of Boston, but is that the way we want to be? Arguably yes, arguably no. The other notable thing here is that the City of Boston gives 1,100 variances a year. That is relief from zoning. Comparable sort of scaled cities in America, Charlotte, Austin, Los Angeles, way bigger, but like they give 100, right? So again, we are superlative in the sense of requiring relief from zoning. What does that mean? It means you want to enclose your porch, you have to go to the Zoning Board of Appeal. You want to add a room, you got to go to the Zoning Board of Appeal. You want to add dormers, you have to go to the Zoning Board of Appeal. You don't even want to change the outside of your building, you just want to repurpose basement or attic space such that it could be livable. You've bumped up your floor area ratio over what's non-conforming, you got to go to the Zoning Board of Appeal. So it's not just about renovations, it's not just about ADUs, it's not even just about adding units. All kinds of modifications to existing houses generally require the consent of the governed, so to speak, of a collective organization of neighbors, community, and a lot of regulatory process, which equals money, to make these changes happen. Which means that the single-family zoning, which went into effect at the time houses were built, now governs a lot of what we have today. And so this idea of multi-generational living, this idea of major demographic shifts in America, especially in Boston, it means that the attempt to modify housing to meet those needs runs up directly counter to what the rules say you get to do. 99+% of Boston is non-compliant with one or more rules in zoning. If you look at a map of Boston and the buildings that are allowed to do things as of right in the City of Boston, you have a map of Boston. And that's not even looking at parking or height, and those are things too. And so what we have to do, and what we are working on, is we have to completely rewrite, effectively, what happens in the homes where people live to enable all the kinds of stuff we just saw lovely renderings and images of, not just at the multifamily scale, but even down to just maintaining pieces of properties. So we're working on it, but yes, the rules get in the way.
What are the chances of reform?
Well, I hope I'm good at my job, sort of. And so the plan, just so anyone knows, is we intend to pass in zoning this update to 3 neighborhoods in the City of Boston, the outermost neighborhoods of the City of Boston, by the end of this year. That is ambitious, but we are working very, very hard on it. And we go from there.
I have a follow-up question for Kristen then. This sounds politically risky. What's the vibe in the mayor's office?
So the one thing that I didn't mention is that while he's responsible for zoning reform, I'm responsible for permitting reform. And they go hand in hand. And if you go to any meeting, almost about anything in the City of Boston, I sat in a room of CEOs the other day. They talked about many things. They spoke about permitting. If you go and try to put in a shed in the City of Boston, you will run afoul of permitting, and so it is a political imperative to reform what are arguably entrenched, outdated systems that keep us from actually meeting the modern needs of our populations. Our city assumes that you are single family, that you're raising a bunch of kids in a space, and that if you try to do anything else, you're like having illegal tenants in your basement. That's actually how it operates. And so if you try to do anything else, and as you were speaking, I almost had PTSD because I did redo my basement and I still haven't picked up the certificate of occupancy because I just couldn't go talk to those people downtown anymore. So we all, not only do we try to work on these issues, but we have to live in Boston, and so we are subject to them. So I think the answer is it is not only a political imperative, but for our city to grow and thrive and become the kind of intergenerational city it must be, so that we aren't like the Cape, right? Think about the issues you hear about the Cape right now. They don't have enough children, they don't have enough housing, they don't have enough young people to do summer jobs. We need to be really intentional so that the policies and procedures and programs that we've put in place don't mean that we end up in that way. And so how are we planning for that?
But the paradox here is that all of those hearings and discussions and ZBA board meetings and the community meetings that are required and the role of the city councilors and their staff, people like that in Boston. It's called democracy. And there are categories of community planners who for principled reasons, truly believe that community discussion is required from almost any issue. And so you run up against, of course, I agree with you. I think most people in the room agree with you. But there are people, there are advocates in the neighborhoods, and there are even people, there are even planners who think that that having a discussion, asking the community is paramount. And so how does the city balance the need for true overhaul with the way things are, which many people think is truly democratic, it truly involves neighbors and those issues? This is back to you, Kristen.
Yeah, no, I was thinking. So there's a couple of different things. So before I had this job, I was the director of the Office of Early Childhood. And one of the first things we did in zoning, ironically, was make childcare as of right in the city of Boston, with the exception of the Marine Yard. It's not allowed there, but anywhere else in the city of Boston. And to your point, there were people who came to I think we had 6 community meetings, and somebody was older than me and remembered when their husband was studying in graduate school and there were children who ran across the floor above them, and so they didn't think that childcare should be allowed as of right in the city of Boston. So, part of the process is that you actually sit in, you listen, and then you move on. So there are some of those kinds of things that part of the process is listening to people, right? That was her perspective. She'd hold on to it for a really long time. She shared it, we listened, and then we moved on. So there are some things that are like that, right? And then there are things that actually, the deliberation is really important, right? I think anybody who's read The Globe lately knows we have some of those conversations happening in Boston now, in a bunch of our development spaces, particularly our streets. And so, while those are politically challenging, they are also really important because the changes we make today are not just about now. They're about 20 years from now. They're about 30 years from now, given the rate at which we redo things, maybe longer. So having that kind of deliberation for really important things is actually an important part of the process. And so I think part of it is figuring out what are the things where you're just sort of listening and saying, thank you very much for your feedback, and moving on and making childcare right. And what are the things that actually we need to take the time and be like, yes, we probably should move on that now, but there are parts of our community who have not had the opportunity to say what they need to say about it, so we're going to wait.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. We've done a lot of needs assessments as part of our initiative, and the listening is absolutely critical. And I think that what's really important for all of us in government is to be really honest about why we want to do something and to try to be as inclusive as possible. So for us to say, the multiple demographics that will benefit from something. So, for example, we're not the biggest fan of bike lanes because of older adults. and so we try to explain to people that might say that, we try to elevate that this is not a homogeneous point of view, that many people and older adults do bike, and they need to be able to safely arrive someplace. And not everybody has a car, even though, in so many of the different models, there might be a zero, parking requirement per unit. So I think what is really important when you are honest with the public in these meetings, people do listen to that, and you do have to do a lot of listening. You have to take a lot of a lot of criticism. But if you're honest about what it is that we're all trying to accomplish, instead of pitting people and groups against each other, I think that is really a different experience. And to just say the benefit to the city to have these child care centers as a right. What are we trying to do? We want to keep families here in the city, and we want to be able to give people that employment and that economic opportunity as well. So really to make this broad argument that a lot of these policies are going to serve and benefit multiple generations, multiple people. And I think people do respect that. But if you just listen, like Christy was saying, and you just kind of, humor someone, they will be angry. And I think it's really important for us to make strong arguments for what we're trying to accomplish and how they will benefit multiple generations and multiple, ethnicities, economic backgrounds, et cetera, why these things are important, and go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think is a good way to frame how the city can lead, because there are a lot of sophisticated advocates around single issues that show up in meetings. And, I was involved with a couple of projects recently where the bicycle advocates were pitted against the transit advocates. And so they were arguing over the real estate of street redesign. And so I think it is vitally important for city leadership, the roles that you play, to say, you have a point of view, you have a point of view, but we have to make a decision for the greater public good. Now, Will, are you ready to plunge into this challenge that you have ahead of you?
Well, I should note that I'm sitting among many people with the words chief in their title, and I'm just a guy. But that's been very fascinating, because because a lot of the work, especially planners, I mean, for anyone who's a planner in the room, this is like the obvious sentence in the room, but you got to go out and talk to people. It's like a fundamental piece of what the work is, and that's great. The catch is that you get asked questions and you have to answer them directly, and if you don't have an answer, you're often required by then your boss to figure out the answer and provide it. And so one answer, for example, one question that was posed, perhaps not in the most kind way, but in a fair way, is like, you're saying all these things, Will, or a person like Will, but it was Will, all these things about nonconformity and the need for change, you're making this big pitch for why something needs to happen, but I don't quite get it. Why is everything not that way in the first place? If there's all these rules, what's the point in having the rules if they don't make sense? Someone must have put the rules there for a reason. What's the deal, right? And, there's lots of sort of intuitive answers one could give, but we checked. We tried to figure it out a little bit. And it's one of those moments where 15 minutes of Excel pivot tables makes a graph that is immensely satisfying. And answering that question was one of them. And so we took a shot and we just said, how about we just look at every parcel in the city of Boston and organize it by year built. When were things built in Boston? And what we found was this very elegant sort of distribution. Half of the small-scale residential in the city of Boston was built before 1924. That is to say, there was no zoning when it was built. Another 40% of the city of Boston was built between 1924 and 1967, when the now current but then amended City of Boston zoning code went into effect. So 90% of the City of Boston zoning code was either 90% of the housing that we think of as Bostonian, that zoning's here to protect, was built before there was zoning or when there was zoning that's a century old. And indeed, most of that housing that was built either before or after, is largely compliant with the zoning code that not 4,000 pages, was about 25 pages. There's a PDF of it on the city of the BPL's website. And then the remaining 10% of housing, it's like the graph was like stuff got built in the 1800s, like stuff was being built because we built things, it was a city, and then 1960s, and then between the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. That's the radio station joke I always make, but it's about zoning reform. Zoning, we then built new zoning code articles independently for every neighborhood that further squeezed it down. And so now nothing's allowed. So the answer is we did it. Like the answer of why the rules are like that the way they are is that we did it. And what's useful about this is that there can be and that happened, in many cases 40 years ago. Perhaps at the most recent, the last one that got done as a neighborhood was 20 years ago. So many people who were involved in that process and took a great deal of personal ownership on it are very active in civic governance today at like the lay level, right? And so there's the narrative that feels right. Like we wrote zoning that's tailored to our neighborhood. That makes sense, right? That's why we have a neighborhood-specific zoning. There's neighborhood zoning that feels right. We did a specific thing for protecting our community, and it was good, and we are proud of it, and it serves us well. We love our neighborhood. And then we can say, and less than 10% of any of the housing that was ever built ever had to follow those rules in the first place. And like, I'm not trying to throw shade on like the early 1980s, but like I love doing GIS and mapping. Like we've done a lot of it now, and the power of having, like computers that can do a lot nowadays is we can actually check, we can actually calculate what is the front, side, rear, and setback, and what is the FAR, what is the whatever of every single parcel in the city of Boston, and we can prove not just that it feels a certain way, but we can actually say, no, these rules have no resemblance to the built form. So it's not about, it shouldn't be, this is how we achieve success, is we have to decouple the narrative of like zoning feeling like one's own thing, it is the definition of a community, and more just like a set of rules that guide things, that ideally even predetermines or adjudicates feels too, I mean, it is legal, but like pre-balances what community process is supposed to do. That's actually the point of the rule, to sort of pick ahead of time what the outcome's gonna be. And so that, I hope, is the path toward rectifying the rules to reflect what we think they're doing in the first place.
I think you're ready to get out there.
Yeah. We gotta get done soon.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think it's time to open it up for questions because I'm looking at our clock. So does anyone have any questions for this panel? No one. Oh, there's Suzanne Schindler in the back. Could you please state your name, your address?
Hi, I'm Suzanne Schindler. I'm a research fellow at the Joint Center. Will, I'm just curious. So can you give us an example of how you're rewriting the zoning?
So, if I were to release draft zoning at a Harvard GSD event in advance of a public process, I don't think that would be the right policy move to take. But I can speak in generalities, yes. So what we've done is we spent a year, more than a year, taking a really hard look at what the housing stock looks like in the city of Boston. In different parts of the city, what are the front side rears? How tall are buildings? How many units are actually there? Not just the way it feels. Like West Roxbury is zoned 99% single family. The zoning literally says 99% of the land in residential West Roxbury is 1F maximum. And at the exact same time, we can say with certainty that 1 out of 3 units in West Roxbury is not in a single family house. So the zoning says West Roxbury is 99% 1F. The land distributed is 85% homes that are single family. It's still a large majority, but for every 2-family household, there's 2 units there, which actually then tilts it even differently, so that it's actually only 1 in 3 households that way. So we have more math that lets us get a sense of what things are gonna be. Then we luckily have a lot of I'm not one of them, but we have a lot of architects on staff, and we sometimes subconsult to architects and urban designers to help us think through what the shapes of buildings can look like that actually could be buildable, that are similar in scale scale to things that are there, but allow for flexibility. And we also are trying to figure out what envelope do we need to allow for changes. Like, what does it take? What do you need to change in an envelope to allow for a dormer, to allow for a new room, to allow for whatever? We're not going to hit 100% conformity. There are big, big houses in some parts of the outer edges of West Roxbury that we wouldn't want to say every single house needs to be, but we're trying to strike that balance. So we drew that out for a really long time. Then we looked at a bunch of analysis across the city, and we spent a long time just like drawing up some initial maps. They're not ready yet. They are not right. Like, we are now having a bunch of other like partner sub-consultants do their worst. Like, be your most rapacious developer and make the worst thing you can, and find where we haven't quite gotten it right just yet. And so we have another 3 months to like battle test this. And so our hope is that we get through all that, and then we can have a public process where we have new draft zoning. It'll be a map and a new chapter of the zoning code. And then there's still, as we're all talking about, a continued public process to actually work through that, explain to the public, let people know what their house is going to be, and and then we have 7 months to do it.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, but no one can ask Will a zoning question.
Sorry.
Yes. Again, if you could, your name, affiliation, that would be great.
Hi, Jacinda Barbahan. I'm from the Congress of New Urbanism in New England and also Abundant Housing, Massachusetts. I'm interested in, maybe this is to Kristen probably, but anybody who can answer it. Are you thinking at the same time as Will about building code reform as well?
So we're not thinking about building code reform. That is a sort of a specific governed by the international building
And the
code
state.
people.
And the state, yeah.
But the state even uses the international building code. So like those things inform each other. It's like a 3-year process to change anything. What we are thinking about is how we make decisions. So in order to put up a sign on a business in the city of Boston, you actually have to go through zoning. It takes 140 days on average to get a sign. So that, it has its origin somewhere. I've actually done all the due diligence and know all about it, and nobody really wants to know. But what we're doing now, and I think the rules are out now, is we have out for public comment a set of parameters for somebody who wants to put up a sign that will cover about 85% of the signs in the city of Boston. And the other 15, you probably still have to go to zoning. But if we pass these new ways of doing business, I don't even know if we're calling it, I don't know what we're calling it, a rule, a zone, I don't know. Zoning, yeah. It's some, yeah, I don't pay attention to the articles clearly. But it means that you could go to ISD, you could pull a permit, as long as the sign that you are proposing fits in that parameters, you're done. That should take your review from 140 days to at maximum 14. Like, that's the kind of change that we're trying to make so that it's really clear that Boston is actually open for business and not in the business of keeping you from opening, if that's helpful. And that's not actually about building code. That's just about what we require.
Thank you. I guess to Will, then I want to ask, are you thinking of the constraints of building code as they are now when you're doing the new zoning, or are you thinking more out of the box and of ways to, and what would you anticipate as a time lag if you're going to do something that's out of the box?
We are not constraining our thinking about zoning to the current building code as written as of now, right now. That said, we are thinking about what the current building code could yield when we have new districts, but all the new districts that we've been working on, this is true for squares and streets, this is going to be true for this one, is that were other changes to eventually happen, when high-rise thresholds change, if and when CLT finally becomes the thing that everyone says it's going to be as the thing, in whatever way single-stair reform may or may not become a thing as a thing.
That'll become a thing.
We're trying to change the zoning first, or we're trying to make sure that the zoning has pre-accommodated those kinds of things. It doesn't make the thing happen, but it doesn't preclude it.
Yeah.
But they can't.
There's an audience here.
Right. Oh, Rafi Siegel.
Say your name and your affiliation, please.
Yes. architect, MIT professor. Are you using AI for permitting reform and zoning reform?
Yes, on the permitting side. So our Office of Technology took 25 years, actually probably more than that, of permits and ran them through AI, because right now it is a box that you just sort of fill in what you want to do. And they came up with 250 different types of permits that are requested in the city of Boston. And then they identified the 60 that are most common. Now, for those of you who build and design things, it is not surprising to you that you don't pull a permit for an ADU. You don't pull a permit for solar panels. You pull it for electrical or plumbing or whatever, right? So that's great if you happen to be a developer. It is not so great if you're trying to do something on your own home. So a piece of what we're trying to do is twofold. One is while we're reforming the process, really thinking about wayfinding for people for whom this is not what they do for a living and they're just trying to find their way through it, which is your basic homeowner, but also someone who's opening a new small business and has never done it before. So a piece of what we're using that AI-powered information to do is the wayfinding, and a piece of it is to reform the process. We actually are going to come out with version 1 later this month for reforming Article 80 small permitting, as well as in May for Small Business Month, a guide for opening a restaurant in the city of Boston. So check them out. There will be a tool where you can use AI to give us feedback.
Maybe one more question according to the counter. Oh, Jen.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back to something, Andrea, you were talking about sort of conflict and the idea of bike lanes, and that older adults, that there are different needs, and that they don't necessarily need to be in conflict, although sometimes they are. And I think back to the story I told at the beginning of the afternoon, that we've talked a lot about like deep intergenerational exchanges and families and intentional communities, and then there is that seeing and being seen thing. And so it just occurred to me, and I just wanted to reflect this and bounce it off of you and get your feedback. The more we don't provide spaces for people of all ages, the less they are seen, the more we can make this argument that that there's this conflict, that it's not about all of us. It's almost, I think it is a democracy issue, really, in terms of being mindful of other people's needs. So just wanted to throw that back to you.
Yeah, I think that's a great argument. And again, to go back to some of the conversation around public meetings and public engagement, when older adults are involved in a process, it usually does go better. So when we did the center running bus lane down Columbus Ave, or it's Columbus, right? We did engage there's many older adult housing buildings in that neighborhood, and we had pop-ups where we were actually on the street and in the in the bus stop, and really trying to dispel this idea that older adults are only a certain way, and that they're not a monolith, and people have, we also serve so many generations. We have people living much, much longer. So people in their 60s or 70s, their 80s, their 90s, the mayor is regularly signing 100-year birthday celebration certificates. And so we have a lot of decades in our particular commission. And so that means there's a lot of different needs within that population. And there are a lot of people that bike, and there are a lot of people that take public transit. And yes, there are people that drive, and yes, there are people that are afraid of the bike lanes. And I think that really explaining to older adults and explaining to the community, it's not just older adults, it's explaining the changes that we're making and how to navigate those safely. I think it's something that we would like to do even more of. I think that we've done an excellent job at the city of trying to make people aware of these changes, but how, okay, so if something's very new, if you have, you have a bike lane that's in between the sidewalk and the parked car, what is the best way to get across, and that's like wayfinding and education. And I mean, it's really important, because when people have been doing something for decades, it's very hard to make these changes sometimes, but give people credit, because they will make the changes, especially if there's an improvement, which often it is an improvement, and it is safer. So it's just giving people the tools and being, as present as you can in the community to tell people what's going on and have them know. So going in those buildings, in those high-rise buildings, and actually saying, okay, this is coming, this is how you can do it safely, this is why we're doing it, what are your questions, and really try to give people those tools to navigate the changes that we're making that we hope are good for every age group.
Great. I think just because of the time now, want to thank the four of you for this panel. It was a good conversation, and please talk among yourselves at City Hall when you're able. But let's give the panel a round of applause. And I think, thanks so much. We have one more thing that we're going to do. I'll come thank you in a minute. Is Jenny and I are going to do a very quick, 10-minute wrap-up that is going to be moderated by Jen, right? Okay.
So as a shorthand for talking about this event, I often would say it's the Intergen event, or it's the multi-gen event, and Tim once at some point said it is the multi-gen event. So, yeah, we stand between you and a lovely reception that includes student work, food and drink. So we won't take up too much time. I thought maybe we could. I'll make one overarching observation that has struck you, and I'll give you time to think as I kick off. I mean, it's very clear from all the panels that policy has not caught up with our demographic realities, our design potential. We heard about constraints on design with our housing options, and even the good policy, I mean, because we didn't talk about this today, but I know that some intentional communities have been not thwarted or challenged by fair housing law about, age, the balance of ages and how you can't, if they have to be officially senior housing in order to maintain that age balance. So, so I think that was one thing that occurred to me, and I thought, well, to advance this cause, to make sure that these solutions aren't niche, because I hear that a lot. Tell me something that's not niche. Tell me something that's scalable. That we have a lot of work to do. But at the same time, one thing that really did strike me, especially on your panel, Jenny, was that working through those problems is part of the community building process. And I don't know if you'd wish to redo zoning reform in Malden, but that was part of a community building process. So that there is something important still about the time it takes and the effort and the community building.
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe one huge takeaway for me was the theme, I think that Donna also touched on in the very beginning, is thinking about your work together on the blueprint, and that actually the narrativization of these kinds of projects and why they might happen, I think takes on the entanglement of especially living in cities that doesn't become the sort of micro experience of individuals and their feelings of discomfort or change that might come with new ways of rearranging space. So in many ways, the way that we can see community process as something that is building towards collective goals that then has to be granular and entangled. And in some ways, I think the three scales successfully, as you've laid them out, talks about the sort of entanglement of each issue and that it's absolutely not monolithic. And in some ways, the conversations around collective housing have often sort of flattened this idea that you're either interested in sharing everything or, you're into your personal space and autonomy. And obviously, it's the shades in between that are so significant.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to come from the other side just because I'm still thinking about our discussion about policy. But in all of the zoning work that we do when we're trying to reform zoning to allow a much wider range of housing stock in a specific neighborhood or a specific district, we have had the most success making an argument that if you, the community, allow this to happen, then you can downsize and live here. Or if you allow a wider range of housing types, then the town staff and school teachers can live here. Or if you make these adjustments, housing will be more attainable to young families because your community is too expensive. And so that's usually the wedge where we get some progress, because then the people in the audience, the NIMBYs, can think for a minute about their own families, their own situations, or the people that taught their kids. And that is often the lubricant that gets things to happen finally. But I think the virtue of working with Jen and Jenny on this conference and the discussion today is there's even a more powerful narrative on top of that. All those strategic arguments that you make to kind of crack open a reluctant community could really be thought of under the rubric of the virtues of an intergenerational community in general. And so I'm going to try that next time. So that's one observation. The other is the first panel, which was excellent, is that the Jennies know that my mother-in-law, who recently passed away, lived with us for 27 years and raised our kids, who are now 26 and 24. And so I wish that first panel had happened when I agreed to that arrangement. I'm just kidding. But I think all of the issues that came up, I don't know if Donna's still here or who's still in the room, it was working through what the rules were. Now, my family is a matriarchal family. It's not a patriarchal family. And I was a happy submissive to follow the rules. But I think those questions at the kind of micro design level about territoriality and where there's a higher level of respect versus you can be yourself, and the patterns that are worked out over time really resonated with me, because it evolved over time to be very, very successful. And I think, and then the hearing that for lower income communities, this only lasts for 2 or 3 years. That's not enough time. It's like a 12-year ramp up. The other thing is that my mother-in-law was really the third parent, and that allowed my spouse and I to be the workaholics that we are. But then, she died when she was 92 in our house, and so it was the beautiful transaction where, she was taking care of our kids a lot of the time, and then for the last couple of years, we were really taking care of her. So with some support for home services and things. So I've lived through it if people want to come and ask me how it went, younger people here, but we were very lucky that we had that. And so my thoughts, so I'm thinking, I lived it, but I'm also very conscious of this, like Will, as I'm always in front of audiences trying to make a case for maybe neighborhoods being designed differently. So.
I also love that you've just enacted, as many have, including Noelle and Jennifer, the sort of autoethnography, right? The theorizing of personal experience as something beyond biography. but as extending into the systems you interact with. Kristen, when you talk about getting the permit for your basement and just, the trauma of going back to pick it up, I understand. So in some ways, this sort of intergenerational, Kenzie Bach speaks about this, when she says, none of us were born with a job, and hopefully we don't have to have a job at the end of our lives at the end, right? That we are all in the near future and in the near past in these phases of life.
But Jen, I'm dying to know what you thought.
Well, I'm just so grateful for everyone being here, for the questions, for your attention, and especially to the panelists who brought so much. I mean, we were, these are three very different scales, but I think we see a through line of, first of all, just having to see something enough times to make it a real possibility in the world. So I thought that all of the examples shared in the second panel were so inspiring. Nesterly has been so inspiring. You kind of have to get there, and I worry a lot. My colleagues know this in the aging in place space, that way too many people are actually stuck in place. They don't really prefer, what they've got. They just don't have the options, and so having options and showing those options and sharing them with the world has been really great. But at the same time, I think the day, we had some sobering realizations, whether it was about zoning or about the lack of a social safety net or about the pressures that households face. There's a lot of work to be done, and that was one of my questions that I was jotting down of what else do we need to know? I'm a researcher, so what else do we need to know? I think we had some talk about post-occupancy, surveys and analysis. We have demographic data that we captures a lot, but maybe doesn't capture all this fluidity. And that was the other thing that struck me, was that households are always, everything is always evolving. These options are evolving, our demographics are evolving, our households are evolving. Zoning is kind of, it's trying to pre-approve and pre-accommodate, but how do we not get stuck? How do we keep evolving?
Yeah. I mean, one very short answer to that I think was absolutely underscored in the first panel, but then in, the idea of the design for rather than the necessity of intergenerational living also asks for adaptation over time, and setting up the conditions for adaptation is absolutely what the design students, and hopefully what you'll see in Stubbins as I sort of tease some poster sessions, right? But how do we encode some amount of reversibility or redundancy in circulation to produce nested autonomy or a sense of cohabitation with forms of, social relationships that are not just the nuclear family.
I mean, for me, and with Noelle's presentation, all of the points of friction, building code, zoning code, tenants' rights, questions of insurance, the complications of ownership structures, in a way, and maybe the Joint Center has done this, to get those all on the examination table together. All of the impediments for all of the good things we heard today, and then to understand the relationships between because as a designer, you run up against all of those issues, and whether we like it or not, that frames and limits what we do. Or my question about how do you get the underwriting for a project that has a net to gross that most lenders won't lend for? So I think, and I don't think that if those that know, because I'm involved with code reform work on the building code side, I don't see these questions as constraints, but a kind of action plan where advocacy through good design examples can be the case that's made to say, there's no reason why people shouldn't be able to do this, but the reason why we can is because of X. So I really enjoyed today hearing all of those other determinants that maybe I haven't thought about just because I'm not designing projects in this space the way that Jenny is. So that was the other thing I wanted to point out.
Well, I thank you. We're only a minute over time, so I think we did a pretty good job in the end here. Shout out to David and James and Samara and Sarah and Raquel, Matt. Thank you for helping us host this wonderful event. Jenny's going to say a word about what you will find in Stubbins, so please, please, please stay for the reception.
Absolutely. You will see some small posters that are an analysis of ongoing housing proposal work in the fourth semester core of the Masters of Architecture. So there's about 70 students who are working on half-acre sites in Allston, East Boston, and Back Bay, thinking about how low-rise, high-density produces zones of negotiation, easement, friction, and balancing community and propriety. So, yeah, I hope you enjoy.